The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 301 Mysterious Figure. The ruins that Lex and the group had encountered were not large. Though covered in plant growth and suffering from obvious signs of wear, some of the buildings had collapsed roofs or walls. Even combining all of them, there were less than 10 buildings. That meant this was too small to be a town or even a village, if those existed in the crystal race culture. Lex assumed that this must have either been a travel outpost, a small research camp, maybe even the private property of someone rich, or something along those lines. A small, adventurous part of him had been hoping that when he entered the building, through some mystical magic or miracle of the crystal race, he would discover the interior untouched by time, and whatever event drove the race from here. That clearly wasn't the case. However, when he entered the building, for the briefest of moments, Lex felt like he saw a figure standing inside. The figure disappeared so fast that under normal circumstances, Lex would have questioned if he even saw something at all. After all, it wasn't usual to catch something from the corner of your eye, but when you turned to look, it was something entirely different. What made him so certain the figure really had existed, though, were the goosebumps on the back of his neck. In that absolute split second, he had felt extreme danger. There was a certainty with which his instincts told him that the figure could overcome his defenses easily, and pose a very real risk to his life. But, for whatever reason, the figure had no intentions of confronting him. Lex squinted his eyes as he scanned the littered room. The floor was covered in dirt and rocks, alongside broken debris that might have once belonged to this building, but was no longer recognizable. He remained standing in the doorway, observing the room, until Quenhild finally joined him. "What are you looking for?" she asked, having noticed him standing there for a while. "There was someone here before us," Lex informed her. "Whoever it was, they disappeared as soon as I approached. I'm checking for traps, but I don't sense anything out of the ordinary." "That's not possible, we're the first ones in this realm. There's still a few hours before others start entering." "I don't know what to tell you, except that there was definitely someone here." Quenhild pursed her lips as she took in Lex's statement. A list of scenarios went through her head, including someone sneaking on to punish or even assassinate her for giving up her family name. But it did not seem likely. "I'll check out the building. Maybe we'll be able to discover what the person wanted." Quenhild nodded, and slowly followed Lex. There was too little information to start speculating, and should not cause her to start suspecting anyone, but it was a fact that the group following her all consisted of people she was paying. They followed her for the prestige and the reward, but considering their qualifications and caliber, none of them were people without sufficient backgrounds. Despite the ongoing war, the politics between the various forces in the human race did not disappear. It became a lot more subtle, and hardly would anyone push things too far, but she was well aware of the cult-like following her father enjoyed. Lex and Quenhild swept the entire building but found nothing of note. They could see that over the years, multiple animals and beasts had turned these buildings into their nests, which, in turn, spoke volumes about the strength of these buildings. But that was it. By the time they exited, the rest of the group was also catching up, Ness panting and completely drenched in yellow blood, but otherwise fine. "Good job, you guys. Ness, Baron and Tim, you guys take a rest in this building. Cindy, harvest anything useful from the bloody jit. The rest, look through all the buildings, and see if you find anything useful. Report back here once you're done. After a short rest and some lunch, we'll move out." The group dispersed as they went about to perform their tasks. None of them needed the rest, but the 3 combatants had exerted themselves, and it was best to keep them in peak condition than continuously push them. Furthermore, had Lex not encountered the mysterious person, perhaps Quenhild would have chosen to quickly look through the ruins before moving on. Now though, she preferred to be more cautious. Lex noticed that she didn't pass on information about the intruder, but chose not to say anything. The ruins, despite all the promise of the crystal race, held nothing too special. In the bloody jit's nest, they discovered a small pond of green liquid that apparently had phenomenal value. Since they could not transport it, the entire group took turns drinking from the pond directly. If Quenhild was able to take control of this minor realm, they would be able to access it as much as they wanted. Until then, though, it was best not to burden themselves by carrying flasks or water skins full of the stuff. When Lex drank it, he felt his entire body heat up for a few minutes before returning to normal. Apparently, this liquid was excellent for cleansing meridians and helped boost cultivation speed. But soon, Lex, as well as the entire group, realized that the situation with Lex was unusual. Everyone, Quenhild included, turned red from the rising body temperature, and soon steam seemed to come out of their bodies. No one commented on it, but the implications of the anomaly were shocking. It was quite simple. Lex's meridians were pure to such a level that the liquid could not provide him with any boost. Everyone quietly contemplated Lex's background, while Quenhild wondered even more what this half-brother of hers had encountered. Other than the liquid, they encountered a few more precious resources that would have otherwise caused the group to squeal, but considering their expectations from the ruins, it was somewhat disappointing. Eventually, the group continued their journey on towards the next set of ruins. As they ventured back into the forest, a figure appeared on the top of one of the buildings and looked at the group. Specifically, the figure stared at Lex. But, for now, that was all the figure did. The trek through the forest this time was much easier. They were not attacked at all, and all beasts kept their distance. The reason was fairly simple. Ness reeked of the blood of an apex predator, and there was no beast that was aggressive to the point of being suicidal. One time the group even spotted an extremely rare and precious plant in the territory of a tiger-like beast. When they decided to take a risk for the plant, because of how genuinely precious it was, the tiger actually ran away. Lex made a mental note: use the blood of a strong beast to ward off attacks. For the simple fact that they were no longer obstructed, the group's travel speed picked up and they soon found the next set of ruins, still within the forest. These ruins were bigger, with hundreds of buildings easily, and were simultaneously in a worse condition. "Are we going to search through these as well?" Lex asked as he looked down at the buildings that had somehow become a part of the forest now. He and the group were looking down from the tip of a particularly long tree that gave them a clear sight over the surrounding area. He had nothing against looking through the ruins, but it would take too long, and he still wanted to go towards the energy source behind the mountains. He didn't know if it was his imagination, but he felt the blue light behind the mountains had dimmed slightly. "Patrick, scan the ruins. Are there any concentrated or high-energy signatures?" said Quenhild, prompting the man to take out his trusted beacon. But, before he got to use it, the group spotted hundreds of flashes of light across the minor realm, spread far apart. At the same time, a massive current was formed in the spiritual energy of the realm, indicating that the realm had formed a permanent open door somewhere leading out of it. The group immediately picked up on what this meant and turned to look at Quenhild to see if she changed her orders. She was considering it. She had not shared this information, but to take over a realm, she would need to find a focal point for the minor realm. The artificially created minor realms did not move through space the way they did in the origin realm, but instead had an entirely different set of rulers governing them. One of those rulers was about the focal point. A seemingly easy guess would be that the focal point of this minor realm should be in the energy-dense area behind the mountains, but that was not necessarily true as the "We're being attacked," Lex said, interrupting her thoughts. Before she could ask about, or even realize, the origin of the attack, he held out his hand and erected his barrier, just in time to intercept an entirely black arrow. Chapter 302 Welcome Guests. The arrow bounced off Lex's barrier with a simple clang sound, as if nothing happened, but Lex's casual expression turned serious. Although there was no visible sign of it, the arrow had nearly punctured his barrier. "We're too exposed, jump down," Quenhild said, before jumping down herself as well. Indeed, the entire group standing near the tip of a very long tree made them easy targets. Lex jumped down as well, his guard up the entire time, but there was no follow-up attack. Considering that they hadn't even been able to see who the attacker was, the group raised their guard instead of relaxing in the absence of a follow-up. Do you think they gave up after their first attack failed? One of the group members asked. Possibly. But that attack was very misleading. The speed and sound of the arrow made it seem like it was ordinary, but if anyone else would have blocked it, the arrow would have torn through your defense. Whoever attacked was very powerful. If they were just probing, then it's likely that they're gone, but if they're targeting us, then they're probably just waiting for us to drop our guard. Lex, stay on guard. Warn us as soon as you sense something off. Patrick, scan the ruins. We're looking for high or concentrated energy signatures. If we don't pick up anything, we'll make a beeline for the mountains. The group spread out a bit, while Cindy and Ness went out to see if they could learn anything about their tracker. Patrick scanned the ruins, but this time it took much longer, for he was being careful not to attract too much attention. When Cindy and Ness returned, their report was worrying. They couldn't pick up any signs of their attacker whatsoever. This meant that whoever it was, they were extremely proficient in counter-tracking, not to mention there was no way of knowing if they were around or had left. Lex couldn't sense anything at the moment, but that wasn't any assurance. There are 3 extremely concentrated energy zones in the ruins, as well as many life forms. I can't differentiate between beasts and people from a basic scan, but regardless, the ruins are full. Lead us to the nearest one. We'll take the most direct route. Quenhild's focus now was on being as direct as possible to save time, but for better or for worse, the peaceful portion of their journey came to an end. While they still created an intimidating enemy for beasts, the beasts were already being attacked by numerous students who teleported near these ruins. In the midst of battle, even if they faced an impossible foe, they had no choice but to fight, and fight they did. The group quickly figured out that the ruins had split into 3 territories belonging to 2 different beast packs and 1 flock or avian beasts, and all of them were ferocious. Perhaps under normal circumstances, it would have taken them time to cut through them, but Quenhild had finally stepped away from just commanding, and was leading the group directly beside Patrick. Her choice of weapon was an enchanted glaive, though Lex had yet to see her use her enchantments, because no foe could survive more than a single cut. Lex wasn't measuring time, but they reached the first concentrated energy zone fairly quickly, and it became immediately apparent why the energy was so dense here. There was a formation surrounding a single-story building. The building was completely untouched, and gave the group a glimpse of what these ruins must have looked like in their glory days. But neither the smooth white walls nor the intricate blue tile patterns drew the group's attention here. Instead, it was a battle between a group of humans and beasts that drew their sight. Quenhild frowned, then sighed. She could foresee how this would end, but the beasts had to die for them to figure out how to get through the formation, so she led her group to attack. The beasts gave them no problem at all, and in a few minutes, the fighting ended. The humans didn't immediately thank them for the assistance, though, and eyed them warily. A glance was all it took to tell that Quenhild and the rest were together, while the others had come together out of the necessity of the moment. Quenhild held the advantage, but the allure of whatever treasure this building held was enough to get them to try. There was a silent standoff between the 2 groups, each waiting to see how the other would react, until Lex let out an annoyed sigh. All right. Let's get on with it. Which one of you is the strongest? Try and attack me. If you can prick my finger, you can join us. If not, I suggest you leave. This is not me forcing you, just by the way. This is me strongly advising you not to fling yourself off a cliff, because you won't like the ending. Without waiting for a reply, Lex held out his hand, as if inviting them to attack. His nonchalance irritated the other group, while his companions silently observed him. In the end, a particularly well-dressed student broke out of the group, looking at Lex with disdain. Who do you think you are, to advise me? I'm advising you, little kid. Get lost, and never show me your face again. If I unleash an attack, let alone your finger, even your ancestors will be decimated. Next time, wash your teeth before talking to me, because your breath stinks just as bad as your threats. You. Lex stopped listening as his expression fell. He was not one to be easily irked by insults, but he suddenly had flashbacks of the system telling him to brush as well. He was an extremely clean and hygienic person, god damn it. Do whatever you want, Lex said as he put down his arm and returned to the group, ignoring the verbal diarrhea being spewed by the arrogant prick. The group was smirking and chuckling as Lex walked back, all enjoying his slight humiliation. It was not out of spite. It was just that Lex was the only one who ever came out of their fights and training unharmed, so now that he finally suffered some kind of loss they couldn't help but enjoy it. Quenhild, too, felt the urge to tease Lex, but ultimately didn't as she wanted to stay on task. Without any forewarning, Quenhild appeared before the ranting student and rammed the back end of her glaive into his stomach, throwing him to the ground. The remaining students, caught off guard, were shocked, and then angered. Though before they could respond, Baron appeared in front of them and crashed right into their group. He was careful not to use too much force, as he didn't want to kill anyone. But the difference between an elite, dual-path cultivator and a single-path cultivator became easily apparent. "This is your only warning," Quenhild said, looking at the group with stern eyes. "Get lost or we'll stop holding back." As he watched the fear and anger paint the students' faces, Lex snorted. That's what they got for wasting his good intentions. "Any idea how to open the formation?" Tim asked. "I can try using my bloodline to do some damage, but if opening this was as simple as brute force, I doubt this formation would have lasted this long." "I could try to read the formation, but that would take a while," said Lex. "No need, we've come prepared. Jovi, link up." Jovi quickly ran up to the formation and opened up his backpack, taking out a number of items that looked like hex nuts. One by one, he began attaching them to the formation surrounding the building, making sure he attached them perfectly level with one another. In the end, he handed the last one to Quenhild, who did not waste time on explanations or ceremony. She channeled her spirit energy, activating whatever items these were. The formation immediately reacted, warping into odd shapes until, eventually, the formation shattered. A wave of dense spirit energy flooded out when the formation collapsed, causing Lex to become momentarily stunned. He was not the only one, as the entire group froze. Not only was this energy extremely concentrated, it was of a much higher quality than whatever they were absorbing. But the stun effect only lasted a moment, mostly because the system absorbed it all. The accumulation rose by 0.1%, bringing his total to 1.3%. Once the rest of the group recovered as well, their eyes became frenzied with excitement and greed as they looked at the building. Whatever it was holding had to be absolutely amazing. "Let go," Quenhild said, "but don't drop your guard. If whoever shot that arrow is still around, they'll take advantage of any distraction." The group quickly recomposed themselves and went towards the building, only for the doors to open on their own. "Welcome guests," said a warm, deep voice. Chapter 303, Sleeping Bunker. Lex felt weird being at the opposite end of a welcome, but he did not let the greeting drop his guard. He peered inside the door, but could not see anyone. The little he could make of the room inside gave him the impression that it was a cozy, carpeted reception, well lit and with a line of chairs to sit in, as well as an empty reception desk. But when he was done looking, he realized that his companion seemed much more wary than him. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Didn't you hear that creepy noise?" Baron remarked, slightly annoyed. The sound, whatever that sound was, gave him chills down his spine. The best way to describe it was an utter gut-wrenching squeal of a dying man. "The noise? You mean the welcome?" he asked, confused. But the confusion lasted only a moment, as he quickly realized what happened. Lex could speak and understand all languages in the universe due to the universal language converter that had been tattooed behind his ear. In fact, most of the time he wasn't even aware that he was speaking in another language, as to him, it was all in English. But the difference became evident in a situation like this, where they encountered a language no one else spoke. The greatest problem Lex had now was, he had no idea what language he was speaking, so if anyone asked, he'd have to make something up. The sound was a greeting which said, "Welcome guests." Though, I can't seem to see who was speaking. Alright, get in defensive formation. Lex, you lead. No matter what the situation, we need to investigate the house. Lex nodded, and walked in, his shield in his hand. It wasn't that he didn't trust his own defenses, but after that arrow nearly broke through his barrier, he decided to stop underestimating everyone. As soon as they entered, a projection appeared behind the reception desk and looked at them. The projection seemed to be a female from the crystal race. Their body structure externally, at least, was remarkably similar to humans except, instead of skin, their body was made up of see-through crystals. The way humans wore clothes to cover their skin, the crystal race covered their bodies in cloth and colored gems. To allow others to look through their clear body was considered extremely indecent, equivalent to a human in the nude. But even wrapped in a simple cloth, with turquoise crystals forming a smooth mask to cover her face, the projection looked immaculate. Under the gaze of her purple eyes, Lex felt a warmth in his heart, as if it pleased him to be looked at by her. The innocence in her eyes, the gentleness of her. Lex's soft expression turned hard as he brought his shield forward and drew his sword, glaring at the projection like an enemy. His sudden action startled the group, as well as the projection, but before anyone could inquire, Lex spoke in the same gut-wrenching language that the group had heard earlier. If the hospitality of your race involves influencing your guest spirit, then I must say, I am quite disgusted by the crystal race. The projection of the woman was suddenly even more surprised by his words, but then giggled. Silly human, why do you resist? Is it not your honor to be deemed a guest by the great, the great, the great? The projection started stuttering, while her seemingly simple and innocent visage began to morph. There's something wrong with the projection, Lex warned, but, just as he was expecting the worst, the projection disappeared and the lights turned off. They waited a few more moments to see if anything would happen, but nothing did. It seemed time had eventually caught up with whatever mechanism was keeping this building operating. Turning on the talisman equivalent of a flashlight, the group continued further in. From the outside, it appeared as though the building was only 1 story large. Yet when they began exploring, they found stairs leading to a basement. Since the remainder of the building was empty, Lex continued to lead the group down as he tried hard not to think of every horror movie he had ever seen. It seemed that the hold horror movies had on a dark basement guarded by a crazy, hostile projection could affect even cultivators. Yet nothing crazy happened. Instead, after a couple flights down the stairs, they encountered a sealed metal door. There was no grip, handle, or anything of the sort, so he had no idea how to open it. While Lex was comparing everything he saw to a zombie movie called Evil Resident, Quenhild was keeping herself from having too much hope. Her instincts told her that such a well-protected and guarded place would surely be the focal point, right? But at the same time, experience told her not to jump to conclusions. To get through this sealed door, Quenhild turned to the last 2 members of the group, the Jade twins. They were both body and spirit path dual cultivators, but that was where the similarity between the two ended. Jade 1, as the older twin was called, was an intellectual, and specialized in materials engineering. Long story short, he was exceptionally good at destroying any object. Jade 2 was strong. That was all there was to Jade 2, but when something excelled to a certain level, it entered a league of its own. Although he had not been able to break Lex's defense with his brute strength, he once picked Lex up and flung him hundreds of feet away with a single flick of the hand. Owing to the hurry they were in, Jade 1 approached the metal wall and, after observing it, began to concoct some kind of solution from different items he had in his backpack. Barely a few minutes later, he added the solution to a plastic spray bottle and lightly sprayed the metal door, immediately causing it to start sizzling, and then eventually dissolve. "Hold your breath," was all Jade 1 said as he returned the items to his bag. Unfortunately, though, the mystery of the building was not immediately solved as they continued down a few more stories before reaching a massive hall that seemed to extend far beyond what their feeble lights could reveal. "What are the chances this is a wedding hall?" Lex asked aloud while mentally telling himself that he had already killed zombies before, so he should not be afraid. "There's too much security for it to be something mundane, yet we haven't seen anything that would reveal what this place is," said Quenhild, doing her best to figure out where they could be. The highest concentration of energy is that way, revealed Patrick, pointing straight ahead. With his shield and sword still in hand, Lex slowly continued towards where Patrick pointed before he reached a large, glass wall. He could vaguely make out a few shapes on the other end of the wall, so he squinted his eyes and brightened up his talisman to get a better view. With the talisman shining brighter, Lex noticed a bit of writing on the glass wall, but suddenly, it didn't matter. He no longer needed to read to understand what this place was. No way, he muttered in disbelief. What is it? Patrick asked, coming closer. As the one with the best idea of how high the energy concentration was, he was the most excited. But the excitement turned into horror the moment he scanned the area beyond the glass with his spiritual sense. This is a sleeping bunker, Lex revealed to his companions, as he recalled what he knew of the crystal race's culture. As a species that enjoyed immortality, one of the favorite pastimes among their citizens was to visit the future. More specifically, since they could live for millions of years, their brains and psyches were developed in such a way that they were not depressed by the thought of living to infinity. As such, the dread of the future was often replaced by curiosity and wonder. But, actually waiting a million years to see what the future held was a bit tedious. A much better way to see the future was to fast forward through the present or as near to that as they could achieve. This desire brought forth the idea of sleeping bunkers. It was like a community time capsule service. Anyone interested could visit a sleeping bunker, state how much time they wanted to sleep, and then be put to rest for dozens, hundreds, thousands of years, or even longer. The bunker would provide them with absolute security, so they need not worry about the hassle of finding an appropriate place to go to sleep for extended periods of time. This was such a popular concept among the crystal race that many knew of it. Lex had even studied about it in one of his classes. And now, standing in front of hundreds of glass capsules with sleeping members of the crystal race, Lex was in one. Chapter 304, for now. Silence filled the room as everyone took in the sight. It was extremely rare for humans to get to see anything of the crystal race's society, let alone something as well protected as a sleeping bunker. Considering the fact that this minor realm had been unoccupied for a countless number of years, he could not even imagine how old these crystals? He could not imagine how old these dudes were. But the level of security suddenly made sense. It was no joke for a protection formation to continue running unsupervised for so many years, let alone the projection that welcomed them once they came inside. But, now that it had been established that this was a sleeping bunker, the next question was, now what? The implications of this discovery were monumental, but no matter what, they could not be allowed to wake up before Quenhild took control of this realm. Lex did not want to speculate on whether they would be friendly or not, since he could not even explain to them why this realm had been abandoned in the first place should they wake. It would be perfectly understandable if they assumed the worst at seeing intruders as soon as they awoke. Do you think the other high-energy spots are sleeping bunkers as well? Lex asked, after the silence had gone long enough. Patrick had discovered 2 other high-energy concentration places that they had yet to visit. Unlikely. It wouldn't make sense to have multiple bunkers nearby. Anyway, let's go. This glass wall should be the last barrier to the bunker and should not be easily penetrated. It will keep anyone else from trying to wake them up, but we should not waste any time. Quenhild's voice was even, and did not betray any emotion besides calm, but internally she was practically swooning. The value of this realm had suddenly exceeded anything they could have imagined, and as long as she obtained this realm before the crystals woke up, she could even negotiate certain terms with her own mother. What do you think it's like, sleeping for years at a time? Lex asked while they rushed towards the next spot. Their consciousness enters an artificial dream shared by all in the sleeping bunker, Jade 1 answered succinctly. They have to maintain such a state to provide stimuli to their spirit, since they're only asleep, not dead. Still, in the dream, time passes by much slower than in real life. A day in the dream may as well be a year. Cool, Lex commented, as he made a mental note of the idea. Maybe he could do something like that in the inn for guests who rent rooms for extended periods of time. While no one said anything regarding it, the speed at which the group moved betrayed a sense of urgency that filled them. The second spot they reached seemed like some sort of temple. Countless students already filled the area, all of them exploring the massive structure in small groups or on their own. Lex and his group paid them no mind and directly followed as Patrick led them to their destination, and if anyone tried to stop them, or worse, rob them. Lex had learned his lesson and no longer tried to play the good guy, meaning the least any of them got was multiple broken bones. Deep underground, after exploring for a few hours, they finally reached an extremely well-protected chamber. Formations, projections, and automated guards protected the chamber, but their strength had fallen greatly over the course of time and so, after some effort, they broke through. For a moment, it felt like they had actually discovered what they were looking for. The room was filled with literal treasure. Crystal coins, weapons, clothes, books, tokens, talismans, and more filled the room. As tempting as the sight was, it was a floating, gold and crystal crown that attracted everyone's attention. But, after probing it, Quenhild revealed that the crown was not what they were looking for. Thus, as much as it physically pained them, the group left all that treasure and went towards their next objective. Trying to carry it would only slow them down, and the realm was more valuable than this measly treasure, anyway. The only thing they took was the crown. They did not know what it was, or what it did, but it clearly was significant and did not weigh them down. The third and final spot in these ruins ended up being a crater. A deep, dark hole, tearing directly through a building, and the ground was violently gushing spiritual energy. They could not even get close, as even Lex started to bleed spontaneously when he approached it, let alone anyone else. Lex could not even absorb the abundant spiritual energy as it was not neutral, and had a very destructive nature. Whatever the cause or origin, it was beyond anything they could handle. With that, they were only left with one option, to head towards the mountains. There were still other ruins they could explore, but they were out of the way, and it just seemed probably that whatever Quenhild needed to claim the realm would be at the most energy-dense spot in the realm. It was a shame, for crossing the mountain would not be a quick task. Even if they ran uninterrupted, it would take them hours to simply reach the mountain. As for crossing the mountain and reaching whatever was causing the glow, it would take a while, to say the least. Not wasting any time, they immediately began their journey, taking the most direct route. Their intimidating presence and urgency caused most to move out of their way, whether they were humans or beasts, but a few still sought to stand in their way, either out of misplaced ego or greed. But with the group no longer pulling any punches, no one could stop them for long. Ness especially enjoyed such violent, full-force clashes, and kept hoping for more of them. Since the only source of light in the realm was that glow behind the mountains, it was hard to track time, but Lex felt like half a day passed before they reached the foot of the mountains. Here they took another break, using the time to eat and drink some water, and take short naps. An hour later, they resumed their journey. Lex had been expecting crossing the mountains to be dangerous, since they were getting closer to the most energy-rich part of the realm. Instead, the journey became even smoother. Let alone encounter a fight, the group did not even see another living being in the vicinity. While this was good for maintaining their travel speed, the eerie silence caused the group to raise their guard. At a certain point, as they trekked through a particularly steep valley, the sound of their footsteps echoed for miles, and yet not even a sleeping bird was disturbed. The mountains had been as still and silent as death before their arrival, and after a while, the peaks started to weigh down on them. An unknown pressure filled the air and began stifling them. Crossing the mountains unabated somehow became more tiring than their journey before. After what felt like an entire day since they entered the mountains, they took their second break. This time, instead of a short break, they rested properly since they had become mentally exhausted. Keeping their guard up continuously for an entire day was more exhausting than actually fighting. But while the group took turns sleeping, Lex sat in a corner with a frown. A strange sense of déjà vu was hitting him. Normally this wasn't exactly enough to worry him, since the feeling would pass. But that was just it, the feeling wasn't passing, but getting stronger as they crossed the mountains. Try as he might, though, he could not figure out what was causing this feeling. In the end, he chose to focus on the inn instead. It would likely be another day before they reached their destination, and there was no point in wasting his time dwelling on nonsense in the meantime. Unknown planet, origin realm. A group of angry and anxious-looking men were gathered around in a circle, their eyes focused on a young man, as well as a shaman who sat opposite to him. The shaman was burning some kind of paper with a pink flame, the smoke released blood red and the ash falling yellow like sand. His eyes were shut, and he seemed to be in some kind of trance. Despite all the focus on the shaman, no one noticed as the tips of his hair started glowing red, and then burning away. At first, one could have mistaken the scene and thought that the group's attention was focused elsewhere, but even as his hair went from simply glowing to being fully aflame, no one noticed. It was only when the flames touched his scalp, and the shaman screamed and let go of the burning paper, that the group suddenly became aware of what had happened. Like magic, the moment the shaman let go of the paper, the flame also disappeared. Yet even in the brief moment that the flame had touched him, all the flesh on his scalp had been burnt away to ash. The shaman collapsed, losing consciousness, but the group, instead of attending to him, swarmed the young man to ensure he was unharmed. Physically, he was fine, but his frustration was eating him alive. Trash. Vermin. Frauds. Can't do anything right. Find someone else, and this time make sure they're not a fake. I need to be able to track my soulmate before Lady Cosmos ends, or I'll never be able to find her. The young man had been trying to divine the location of one of the contestants of the Lady Cosmos show, but how could it be so simple to peek into the secrets of the Midnight Inn? Just like him, countless others all over the universe had learned of the Lady Cosmos show as its popularity had exploded. And just like him, countless others were undeterred by whatever prestige the inn may have had, and tried to find its guests, or learn its secrets. For now, only the shamans and prophets who were trying to learn the inn's secrets had suffered its backlash. For now. Chapter 305 Boss Battle. Lex had been checking the inn on and off, ensuring that no issues occurred. Unfortunately, despite the deterrence of a dragon, petty fights still broke out often. Not all guests were as particular about how they behaved, and others believed themselves special. Lex actually laughed the first time he overheard someone screaming, "Do you know who my father is?" Now, though, even mild irritation was a huge reaction for such behavior. After all, it was just too common. But, considering that currently he had a little over 5 million guests in the village, it was excusable. The pressure of so many guests was immense, but so was the reward. On average, most guests came in parties between 2 to 4. Even if all of them shared a room, and only rented the cheapest room, then on the average of 4 guests to a room Lex was earning 62.5 million MP a night. But they most certainly were not just renting the most basic room, and they didn't always cohabitate either. Other than the rooms, Lex was earning a lot from food, not to mention the income Lady Cosmos was generating directly. All in all, Lex currently had 978,666,432 MP. This was after he spent another 10 million MP on more security, and another 5 million on more temporary employees. This time there were no more dragons or other over-the-top cultivators, mostly because what Lex needed was a higher number of guards, not higher quality of guards. After all, just the 30 Earth Immortals he already had as guards were more than enough. As of yet, despite the massive influx of guests, Nascent Realm was the highest level guest this event attracted. This proved that the kind of attendance he got for the Midnight Games was an anomaly. Lex was very excited because with this kind of MP, and his elevated authority, he could really upgrade the inn way beyond its current situation. But that would have to wait till he had more time. Currently, he was just checking in. He saw a system notification stating that due to the Destiny Protection upgrade Lex had previously received as a reward for the Midnight Games, many attempts at scrying or tracking his guests had been blocked. For once, he was glad an issue was resolved before he even had to do anything. Feeling slightly generous due to his newfound wealth, Lex distributed 566,432 MP to all his permanent workers as a bonus. Obviously, the higher-ranking workers, such as Gerard and Velma, received a higher cut, but either way, it was sufficient for all his workers to enjoy for a while. As it happened, through sheer coincidence, after the bonus, Lex was left with a neat 978,100,000 MP. With that, Lex stopped monitoring the inn and decided to get some sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day. A few hours later, Lex was woken up, and the group continued their journey in the desolate silence. For the most part, they were going through valleys, or around hills, but the last stretch was too wide a diversion, causing them to climb directly towards the top of the last mountain to get to the other side. The gentle blue glow seemed to get brighter as they neared the top, but it was in sharp contrast to the weight that seemed to be pressing them down into the ground. With each step, it grew stronger, and by now, it was no longer something that could simply be ignored. There was something up ahead that was influencing them from afar. Everyone had already come to that conclusion. All they could really do was bear with it and be prepared for anything. As they approached the final peak, along with the pressure, suspense grew. Lex felt his heart beating in his chest, each beat harder than the last. In the silence, he felt like he could even hear it. But Lex did not feel like letting the moment lord over him, so his speed only grew until he found himself standing at the peak of the mountain, looking over. In front of him lay a wasteland. Time had surely corroded away the truth of what happened here, but hundreds of bare craters covered the land. Bits and pieces of armor were still visible, after all this time, but most of it had faded away. In certain areas, the earth is black, as if scorched eternally from the fiercest of flames, marking the land forever. This was the site of a once great battle, that much was certain. In the center of it all, in a structure like a Roman pantheon, was a gold dish with a massive blue flame. Right in front of that flame, however, stood a dark figure with its back turned to them. Yet even from so far away Lex could identify who, or rather what, that figure belonged to. Suddenly it all made sense. The pressure they had been feeling, the sense of déjà vu, all of it. It was a craven, as well as its coercion. No doubt it had already killed every beast and animal in these mountains. It made no sense though. What was a craven doing here? How did it get here? Why was there only one? But that didn't matter. As if orchestrated by an invisible hand, before them stood their mortal enemy, guarding what Lex suspected was their objective to begin with. Mr. Innkeeper, that flame is absorbing all the energy in the area. If you put it out, the energy will be free for you to take. Lex nodded, showing his understanding, but his companions mistook his gesture. To them it seemed like Lex had mentally prepared himself for a tough fight. "What the hell is a craven doing here?" asked Ness, dumbstruck. "I don't know about that, but I suspect that blue flame has something to do with it," answered Lex. "It's refining the realm," answered Quenhild gravely. "It's found the focal point, and is taking the realm for itself." "Patrick, can you scan it? How strong is it?" "I can't confirm how strong it is specifically, but it's somewhere in the golden core realm," Patrick answered with a look of disgust. He knew that they would have to fight that thing, and he wasn't really looking forward to it. "A lone opponent in the golden core realm, it's nothing we can't deal with. This is exactly what we've trained for, to fight enemies stronger than us. Once we beat it, the prize is ours. Cindy, scout out the area. Make sure there are no other surprises waiting for us. Sylvia, bring everyone to top shape. Jovi, start planning the best approach. Tim, replenish your strength as much as you can, we'll be depending on your bloodline." So Quenhild did not let anyone dwell on the task that lay ahead of them and immediately started making preparations. It was fitting for the final enemy to be a craven. No one would hold back, and everyone here had trained exceptionally long on how to defeat one. Furthermore, everyone here was an elite. The difference in a major realm was not one they couldn't overcome. Whether Quenhild's distractions worked or not, Lex didn't care. He wanted that fire put out so he could get the energy, so he was ready to fight. He needed no pumping. No one was taking the upcoming fight lightly, so the preparations took a few hours. There were no indications of any other craven, which was a huge relief for them. With everyone ready, they directly trekked down the mountain. They did not try to be stealthy, or hide their approach. Their actions were not out of bravado, but simple knowledge of their enemy. None of the races had studied the craven with as much depth as the humans, which is why everyone knew that this creature that had been dominating the crystal realm was not doing it out of sheer luck. Its senses and awareness were beyond many other races, and had several extra senses than just sight or hearing to detect enemies. Let alone the echoes that had been heralding their approach, just the slight temperature difference their bodies caused in the ground was enough to alert this enemy. A simple example of its foreknowledge was the coercion it had been putting out on them the last 2 days. Coercion was not a trait specific to craven, and even humans could do it once their cultivation rose a bit, which is why there was such a deep understanding of it. Coercion didn't naturally exist, and had to be exhibited. Just this was proof that the craven had been warning them not to approach. But since when had the human race taken instructions from craven? Baron loudly popped his knuckles as they continued their approach, and Ness was sharpening her blade. Sohee's eyes were already emitted a purple glow as she readied her spells. The rest were also winding themselves up for the incoming fight. As for Lex? It seemed like he was simply walking with his hands in his pocket, but internally he was debating. Should he risk using an array, or should he risk using evisceration? Chapter 306, Lex, the Defender. As the group walked up towards the craven, they spread out and assumed their proper formation. Ness, Baron, Jade 2, and Tim were at the forefront, as they would be attacking. Behind them were Lex and Quinheld. This was so that Lex could quickly move forward if he needed to block an attack, but mostly it was so that Lex could stop any attacks towards the rest behind him. Quinheld was close enough to attack as needed, but also a step back so she could coordinate the group. Behind the two were Jovi, Sohee, and Jade 1, to provide support, with the rest farthest back as not only were they the weakest in terms of combat ability, their actual roles allowed them to work from a distance. Lex recalled everything he had learned about cravens so far. First of all, other than the usual sight, sound, and spirit sense, craven had another sense that made them extremely sensitive to any changes on the ground, whether it was the pressure of someone walking, the moisture from a single drop of sweat, the mild change in temperature due to body heat, all could be sensed by the craven. Their superiority on the ground was unmatched, not because they could manipulate it, but because it basically served as another sensory organ for them. Furthermore, they were completely equipped to not only absorb all that information, they could fully process and act on that information in real time. This meant it was effectively impossible to ambush a craven unless one could fly. Secondly, craven had an incredibly muscular structure, but in weaves and layers that somehow multiplied their strength. They had 2 legs and 2 arms, but a majority of the time they stood and moved using all their limbs, similar to a gorilla. In lieu of skin, their bodies were covered in a thick, gray leather-like material. But, at all times, their bodies excreted and were covered in a viscous, black slime that moved around their bodies. Craven could use and control that slime as they wished, but not only was it poisonous to almost every other living being, it was very selectively sticky. That meant that normally the slime would not drip from the craven's body, but if a creature came close to it, the slime would latch onto their bodies and was almost impossible to take off conventionally. This way, the slime would often end up endlessly poisoning all of a craven's enemies. Thirdly, craven's bones and joints functioned differently from humans, or most other creatures, for that matter. It had to be repeatedly emphasized that cravens had a very muscular structure, but also that the muscles were layered in weaves, with the craven maintaining fine control over every single layer. What did this mean? It meant that while human limbs, for example, were limited in the directions they could move due to their joints, craven could move any limb in any direction it wanted whatsoever, a fact that made it incredibly difficult to predict their movements. After all that, only a few minor details and specifics remained, such as nails that could cut through metal, teeth that could endlessly regrow matched with jaw strength that could allow it to eat a building, not to mention any individual strengths, talents, skills, or affinities any individual craven may have. Also, its only physical weakness, its energy core, was hidden in its chest, surrounded by a dense, metallic structure. That's correct, its only physical weakness. Even if you cut off a craven's head, or even went as far as dicing up its entire body, so long as the core existed, the craven would still be alive, and could eventually recover. It was this single fact that allowed the craven to fight the entire realm on their own, and still come up as the winning side. This was their own form of immortality, and some believed they were even superior to the crystal race in this regard. Of course, the fact that the craven had not been able to affect the crystal race in any way whatsoever said otherwise. Lex took in a long, deep breath before slowly letting it out. This was the first time he was going to participate in killing an immortal. It was alright if he was slightly nervous. As if Lex's sigh was the signal, the obviously preoccupied craven turned around, pointing its long ugly face towards them. It growled aggressively, the sound causing the group's advance to slow as they coped with a sudden wave of dizziness. Oh yeah, the craven could also launch spiritual attacks with their voice, Lex suddenly remembered. It was not an overwhelmingly strong attack, but still an incredibly frustrating one to deal with, especially in the heat of battle. He was so nonchalant because he was the only one unaffected by the spiritual attack, since his natural defense worked against all paths, body, spirit, and soul. The next moment, the fight abruptly started. There was no probe or buildup of any sort. The craven lunged towards the group, swinging its right arm to cleave the entire group in half with a single attack. Yet instead of the distracted humans affected by its growl, what awaited it was Lex, standing in its path with both his arms held forward. This was yet another alteration he made to talk to the hand. By using the technique in both hands simultaneously and overlapping them with each other, he fused them together, making them much stronger. The craven's attack landed on the barrier, but did not manage to break it. Lex was pushed back, his feet digging deep into the ground, his arms nearly buckling under the weight of the Armageddon he just blocked, but he managed to hold. Ness and Baron raced past him as they kicked off the battle with their strongest attacks. Jovi, though slightly late, had used a technique to increase their resistance to spiritual attacks to prevent such mishaps in the future. Ness and Baron's technique did little more than cause the craven to stumble backwards, and as they attacked with their weapons, the ever-vicious slime coating the craven's body absorbed the strength of their attacks. Just as it seemed that their weapons would get stuck in the slime, a familiar shriek filled the air, followed by purple ribbons flying through the air to surround the craven, so he was using one of the numerous attacks that made her profession as a witch so revered. It tried to dodge, sensing danger, but as it happened Tim was standing behind it, prepared. A massive, fiery explosion occurred. While the craven remained unhurt, it had been slowed just enough for the purple ribbons to wrap around its body. The slime on its body sizzled and then was lit aflame in a purple fire. The craven, in pain and angry, let out a roar that shook the very ground, but its anger could do nothing about the fact that it had suddenly become naked of its slime. Still, the roar disoriented the group once more, for even with Jovi's support, the effect of the spirit attacks had only been weakened, not eliminated. The craven, still on fire, smashed down a palm to kill Tim, but Lex appeared once again in the nick of time. This time, Lex was using his shield to cover his body as he pushed Tim away, just in time. Still, without the barrier to block the attack, Lex would have to face the full brunt of the craven's anger, or so it seemed. When the craven's palm landed on the shield, instead of the expected sound of metal being crushed, only a solid thud was heard, followed by the sight of Lex sliding back, relatively unharmed. Lex had used ripple shell on the shield, so any impact on its surface was equally distributed over its body, making it easier for Lex to manage. But the fact Lex's left arm had dislocated said much about how successful that plan had been, and even more about Lex's own ridiculous endurance. P1E's Visi, T, Nov 1B, in.ne, T. But there was no follow-up attack for the split second it took the craven to attack Lex. Quenhild had launched her own attack. The craven, of course, was not at all surprised by her attack and used its other arm to block her attack. But she was Quenhild, the daughter of a woman who dared to blackmail even the king, so how could her weapon be simple? Her glaive encountered little resistance, and cut through the craven's hand like a hot glaive through butter. What the shit, the craven roared, genuinely surprised. But, for Lex at last, its yell was by far the most surprising thing. Oddly enough, no one told him craven could talk. But Lex didn't have time to be surprised, or enjoy Quenhild's successful attack, as a feeling of dread fell upon him. Ambush, he roared, and used home sweet home, throwing his body at full speed, just in time to block a black arrow with his shield, saving Quenhild. But the rest of the group had not been so lucky, and their cries filled the air. Chapter 307 Puppets. Unlike the first time they were attacked, when the arrow had all the indications of just being a normal attack, this time, the attack was silent, swift, and deadly. The group was too split up for Lex to defend them, and while he had perfectly dodged the arrow aiming for him and protected Quenhild from hers, the rest of the group were left to defend themselves. Surprisingly, Patrick had managed to dodge the arrow aiming for him perfectly, and even managed to save Sylvia, the healer. Everyone else, however, was unable to dodge. Due to Lex's warning, they had dodged a fatal attack, but from Baron to Ness to Jovi and the rest, everyone had suffered. Cindy and Jade One were hurt the worst, with the arrow tearing through their torsos, and were retreating with pale faces. Only the fact that they were also body cultivators kept them from immediately collapsing. The timing of the attack had been perfect, not only ensuring Lex was too far to help but also happened just as everyone was coping with the craven spirit attack. Had it not been for Lex's warning, this simple surprise attack would have ended the entire group. Very aware of the fact that an angry craven was right behind them, Lex leapt forward to get some distance, while a furious Quenhild searched for the attackers. Unexpectedly, they did not hide this time. 12 figures covered from head to toe in black clothes, all holding bows, stood a short distance from them. She squinted. The number of attackers could not have been a coincidence. Someone had been aiming for them from the very start. But who was crazy enough to do that? Even if she cut her ties with her father, she still had her mother's support, not to mention that each one of the members of her group came from one powerful background or another. If even a single one of them died, it was not something that could be suppressed, and there would be a full investigation, with immortals at the lead. But, it did not matter. They were in a tough spot now. Had there been no interference, they had a good chance of killing the craven. But with these assassins attacking from the back, they were done for. Lex, can you delay the craven? She asked, desperately thinking of a plan. For a short time, sure. Give me 5 minutes, she said, as she stepped to the ground. From the moment he saved her, Lex had been running while carrying her. 5 is pushing it, aim for 3. I'm just a man in the Foundation realm, and that's a craven in the Golden Core. Every second I occupy his time is a miracle, technically. Quenhild snorted at Lex's remark. The urgency of the situation and her erupting anger did not mean she didn't notice the complete lack of anxiety or tension in his voice. It was not the tone of one praying for a miracle, but that of one who had the situation completely under control. During their time together, she had noticed a mild resistance Lex exhibited when following her orders, though with time, he had managed to learn how to hide it better. But since she already knew what to look for, she always found it. The look in his eyes, the way he stood, even the way he spoke all hinted at the fact that he was used to authority, backed by real power. It was ironic that he, the one sibling of hers who went without his family name, carried the nobility of his royal bloodline the best. Even now, while he tried to hide the true extent of his abilities behind modest words, his temperament did not allow his diminishing words to actually diminish his image. All of that was but a passing thought as Quenhild turned her attention towards the assassins who were once again knocking their arrows, and bolted off. She yelled orders as she ran, quickly reorganizing the group's formation towards attacking the assassins, and allowing the injured to retreat. Lex was left alone to deal with the craven. Speaking of which, Lex turned towards the craven in confusion. He was expecting a swift retaliation that never came. But he immediately realized why. The craven had picked up its hand and was reattaching it to its body, holding it in place with a lot of slime. You know, it actually never occurred to me that craven could talk. Though I guess everyone considered this knowledge too basic to even mention to me. Anyway, hi. I'm Lex. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we just talk this out? I've always been very curious about you, Craven. I have so many questions. The craven looked at Lex with its head twisted, as if looking at something strange. Lex could see it trying to move the claws on its severed hand. It seemed the reattaching process was not so easy. It is because inferior races cannot understand our language, or tolerate the resonance our voice brings. How curious that you can understand. A single claw flinched, but it had not yet perfected its movement. Resonance? Is that what causes the spiritual attack in your voice? What is that? The craven didn't answer, and turned its head to look back at its arm. It was regaining movement. P1E's Visi, T, Nov 1B, in.ne, T. You're right, that's a bad question. Let's focus on other, more important questions. You see, I have a unique perspective when it comes to looking at the bigger picture. I can see things that others really can't. But I still don't understand, why are the craven at war with the whole realm? What's the point of fighting everyone? Lex was walking as he talked, positioning himself between the craven and the rest. In a rush to save Quenhild, he had dropped his sword somewhere, but his shield was very much still in his hand. According to my teachers, you don't have a biological need driving you. You don't need to slaughter all the races endlessly for your own survival, and I doubt your resource consumption is so high that you need the whole realm. The craven still did not talk. It had regained almost perfect control of its hand, and its body and slowly started to once again secrete the slime that usually covered it. Alright, if you don't. Lex's next question was cut short by the craven bursting into motion. One moment it was still, the next it had the full speed and ferocity of an avalanche. It was not running towards Lex, though, and instead its eyes glared angrily towards Quenhild. But, regardless of how abruptly it had moved, Lex had been expecting it. Holding out both his hands, Lex appeared in its paths, causing the craven to smash directly into the barrier. Since it was a crash instead of an attack, Lex's barrier withstood the force with comparative ease, but Lex was still almost knocked over. Move out of the way, vermin, the craven roared, still not even bothering to look at Lex. I can tell that you think you're a superior race, Lex said, his voice somehow managing to retain its sense of calm and curiosity, even as he ran to once again block the craven. But if that's the case, why are the craven allowing themselves to be used like puppets by all the races? The genuine innocence in Lex's voice as he asked was somehow more grating than the question itself. We are No1's puppets, the craven roared, finally turning to look at Lex. The entire realm trembles beneath our might. Lex should not have considered attracting the creature's fury an accomplishment, as the craven smashed towards Lex's barrier with both hands, this time firmly breaking it. Lex tried to jump back, but one of its claws firmly landed on his chest, cutting his armor to ribbons. 3 ugly gashes cut open on his chest, though he did not bleed, for slime had covered them up. Well, it was a good thing he had ripple shell used on himself the entire time, or instead of a few gashes, he would have a hole in his body. Of course, that single attack had destroyed the shell, so unless he used the technique again, it was best not to get hit. Lex grimaced. The craven's brute strength was already a hassle to face, but its claws were just too damn deadly. As for the slime, Lex looked down, then ignored it. If he tried to pull it off, it would only glue his hand to his chest. The slime would slowly poison him, but he should have some resistance to poison. He would be able to get rid of it if he used an array, but the craven would not give him the time to form one. He really needed to practice with them more. Oh yes, the realm is firmly at war with the craven, and everyone is losing, and there's so much fear, Lex said blandly, as if he was that water was wet. And yeah, you managed to somehow take over the territory of an entire race. But since then, what have you done? There's constant progress, but it's slow. The threat of the craven is ever present, but you know. Lex used talk to the hand with both hands, but also jumped back as the craven attacked once again. He couldn't dodge too much or the craven would go towards Quenhild, but he also couldn't take head-on attacks. Why was life so hard? But you know, like I said, I have a different perspective on things. Between all the fear, the propaganda, the fighting and mobilizing all the race's strength to fight against the craven, all you've really achieved is strengthening the reign of each of the race's respective king. After all, before the craven, none of the races had ever banded together to form a unified nation. Now, well yes, you take land each year, but it seems to me that the humans at least put up just enough resistance to slow down your approach to an acceptable level. Speaking just for the humans, all you've really done is strengthen the king's control on these lands. I can tell that much just by studying the basic history for the last few hundred years, so others should be able to tell that much as well, right? Which is why I asked, why are the craven acting like puppets? Chapter 308 A Double-Edged Sword. To a degree, Lex was speaking randomly, doing whatever it took to distract the craven even for a moment. But at the same time, a lot of what Lex said was based on his own speculations. He had been studying the history of the realm, and while it was mostly focused on the development of the Hum nation, while studying politics, he got bits and pieces of what was going on with the other races. Under the very real threat of the craven, behind the massive war machine that the human race was morphing into, beyond even the endless waves of brainwashing and propaganda that taught the masses the very purpose of their existence was to fight off or kill the craven, Lex sensed a severe lack of desperation. That was not to say that the common man wasn't desperate. No, the life of the average person was lived under the shadow of an ever-impending doom and a relentless struggle to do absolutely anything to overcome it one day. Even the middle, and some of the upper classes of society had their lives painted with desperation. But at the highest level, where policies and strategies were made, where the future was planned and the direction of the people's lives were decided, Lex sensed a very focused and calculated calm. Since his background was supposed to be from Bristol, or at least that's where he had been brought from, Lex had studied the retreat and eventual fall of the human forces from there. The very calculated way in which reinforcements had been sent to the border, and not Bristol itself, and the precise way in which important forces were withdrawn while letting the main part of the army in Bristol fight to the death felt all too calculated to Lex. Had true desperation been present among those in power, they would have sacrificed as much as they could to ensure the craven suffered the most damage they could inflict, instead of just retreating. Lex remembered, back when Vigus Minima had not yet come under control of the Jotun forces, how Chen and Blaine went on a suicide mission to distract zombies so that their caravan could pass through without being detected. The will and determination of Lily, the head of the caravan, to send her own brother on a suicide mission reeked of the desperation to struggle and survive. The Hum nation, despite all the efforts it was putting into it, had not yet come even close to that. There were a few other hints he picked up here and there, but the basic gist of it was, the massive realm-encompassing war was not as straightforward or dire as it seemed. He was hoping to extract some answers from this particular craven, but after all that Lex said, the craven simply looked at him. It was not that it didn't get baited in by what Lex had said, but that it just did not bother responding. The hate and anger in its eyes though were unusual. It was more than just being taunted, or at least, that's what Lex thought. Alright, not puppets, but what? Lex jumped back while using talk to the hand with both hands as he tried to avoid the hurtling craven. Lex had goosebumps all over his body, and he felt with certainty that the fight was no longer the same. If the craven was taking things lightly before, which unfortunately for Lex it had been, it was no longer doing so now. Lex narrowly avoided the clash due to his instincts warning him in advance, but comparing speed with a golden core cultivator was a stupid decision. The craven, when it stood up straight on its legs, was twice the size of Lex, but its nimbleness was remarkable. Lex was too close to it for large maneuvers, and the tempo of the fight was too fast for him to ask any more questions. While Lex would have jumped completely out of the way before to dodge a punch, now he had to limit himself to moving just his torso just enough to avoid a direct hit. It was a scene out of a movie, or perhaps an anime, as Lex dodged each of the craven's claws perfectly, moving his body before the creature had even begun its attack. For a time, they became a blur as their bodies wove the fight into the most intricate dance, with each of them moving just right as if they had practiced the performance a million times. Instead of enemies, they seemed two machines, working with mechanical precision. In the few seconds, Lex had become completely drenched in sweat, and then the sweat started rising from his body as steam. Incredibly, he could actually feel his muscles rip, ever so slightly, not from the craven's attacks, but from the extreme duress he was putting them under. As much as he wanted to pull away and create some distance between them, the craven gave him no time at all. But the seemingly splendid tango ended just as swiftly as it began when a small rock under Lex's foot crumbled. It was not enough of a difference to cause him to fall, or even stumble, but it was enough to affect his balance for a split second. It was in that split second, as if the craven had planned for the moment, that Lex found not its arms, but its leg kicking towards his face. Time seemed to slow as Lex looked right at the claws, gleaming under the soft blue light, heading towards him. Lotus or no lotus, if his brain was punctured there was no saving him. But what could he do? The beast was too fast. Even knowing how to defend, it would take too much time to actually move his limbs in place. Even if he had a technique that could save him from this situation, he could not move the spirit energy fast enough to perform a whole technique. A million thoughts ran through his head and he thought of every technique, array, item that could move his body just slightly to get out of the way just enough. When Lex could not think of a good solution, he settled for a bad one. With his index finger, he started drawing the character for fire, and then screwed it up. Lex's body was flung back, deep orange flames licking his body as he flew through the sky. Lex ignored the uncomfortably familiar sensation of burning skin as he quickly took a look around. Much like him, the craven was covered in flames, though they seemed to be dying out quickly. He looked towards Quenhild and the rest, and found that their battle was still ongoing. With a groan, he looked back towards the craven. Purely defending was getting him nowhere. As much as he wanted to avoid it, he had to attack. The craven had been stunned. Not by the strength of the explosion, or some attack, but by the fact that he had taken the fight seriously and yet, the inferior creature had managed to survive. Then the feeling changed to shame. Then to anger. It roared, lifting its head to the sky to warn even the heavens of the consequence of crossing it. Everyone in the vicinity save for Lex was affected by the tsunami-like spiritual attack carried in its voice, but that pleased the craven. It would be too easy otherwise. It would slowly and purposefully rip that inferior creature limb from limb. Once again, the craven ran towards the inferior creature, this time at full speed. Oddly enough, the creature seemed not to be avoiding this time, and only stood still. Perhaps it had accepted the inevitable. But just as the craven reached its prey, and was about to dismember it, the inferior being's eyes changed. His pupils turned black, as if hiding a void behind them, and from the void the craven felt the threat of death. There was no ray of light, no shockwave, no sound to mark the attack that came from Lex's black eyes, except maybe the guttural cry of the craven as it crashed into the ground, its body dragged by its remaining momentum to Lex's feet. Lex was still standing straight, like a hunter before its fallen prey, but his sudden paleness hinted at something more. He vomited out some blood, but he wiped his mouth as he looked at the effects of evisceration. It was an extremely potent soul attack launched from one's eyes. All the attack needed was for Lex to be looking at whoever he wanted to attack. It could not be blocked using normal means, and would require tools or techniques specifically focused on defending the soul. Furthermore, it did not matter how close or far the enemy was. Without any indication or forewarning, the technique would land on the target as soon as it was used. Moreover, as it so happened, while craven had only that one physical weakness of the core in their chest, their soul was as vulnerable as everyone else's. Under the nascent realm, wherein most creatures lacked a means to protect their souls, such an attack was the most dangerous. But there was a good reason Lex hadn't used the technique right from the start. He had not yet completely mastered it, and as such, he would also take a lot of damage whenever he used it. A tremor ran through the craven's body as it lifted its head to look at Lex with murder in its eyes. Chapter 309 Greater Than the Rumors. Don't give me that look, I didn't want this. I just wanted to chat, said Lex as he held out his index finger. Right before he started to draw an array, however, he paused, withdrew the index finger, stuck out his middle finger and started to draw. A stream of blood started to flow from Lex's nose, but he ignored it, and instead continued to talk to the craven. I doubt you've had a change of heart though, right? The craven said nothing as it tried to move its body. Physically, he was still in peak condition, but his soul was just in too much pain. All the rage in the world couldn't keep it from losing its control. What's worse, though, was that the pain was slowly getting stronger. His soul was like dry wood, and a flame had started to spread from one corner. No amount of pride could douse such a flame. I had so many questions. Where did the craven come from? Were they always indigenous to this realm? Did they come from somewhere else, or were they just a new species that was somehow born? The craven was growling as it struggled to gain control even through the pain. The ground gently trembled under the terrifying gurgle, but Lex paid it no mind. First of all, if he did something, he would have to give up on his array. Secondly, he had read enough about soul damage to know how debilitating it was. Not everyone could brush it off the way he could. Once I had a random thought. What if the craven were actually looking for something? Like a treasure or something, right? But since they didn't know what they were looking for, they just fought all the races for their land till they found it. But I have nothing to base that thought on, so I scrapped it. I do have one, slightly more specific question though, maybe you could help me out. How did you get in here? Lex paused to look at the craven, but it was still growling, so he continued to talk. Honestly, his talking was more to just distract himself from the pain he was feeling. He did not expect the craven to give him any answers. Like, I'm sure that this realm was searched at least briefly before students were let in. How could a craven escape the Academy's notice? Did you come in after us? Or have you been here for a long time? The craven, while still disoriented, managed to move its arm and pressed it against the ground. It was trying to pick itself up. What were you doing with that fire, anyway? Were you trying to capture the realm? Wait, was the reason these mountains were empty because of your coercion? If that's the case, you must have been here for a while. Did the crystal race abandon this realm because of cravens? The answer to his questions didn't matter, for he finally finished his array. It was a very simple, very focused array that served only one purpose, one that Lex would not enjoy. A bright yellow flame formed midair, where Lex finished the array, and slowly moved towards Lex's bare chest. The black slime covering his wounds sizzled as the flames approached and soon started boiling. Lex clenched his teeth and groaned as he allowed the flame to burn away the slime and cauterize his wounds. Somehow, he managed not to yell. But once the array faded, Lex did not feel any better. There was poison in his system and evisceration had caused him internal injuries. He could not even focus on whether his scars would look cool over his abs as he turned to look towards Quenhild and the rest. Their fight was almost over, with only a few assailants left. Had he managed to defeat the craven before they finished their fight? It seemed so. It would be smart to use this time to crush the craven's core, but he was not strong enough, and a sufficient array would take too much time. He turned his attention towards the blue flame. So long as he put that out, he would be able to absorb some energy. But he didn't know if putting out the flame would somehow affect Quenhild taking the realm, so he did the most anticlimactic thing ever. He just waited for them to finish. The craven was grunting and even yelling as it continued to lift its body, but kept on stumbling. Lex would be highly impressed if it could do anything in this state. The pain from its soul aside, the soul is literally what gave it life. With a damaged soul, its ability to continue to even stay alive was highly compromised, let alone anything else. If anything, its state was a testament to how superior craven actually were, for a lesser being's soul would have already collapsed after taking such a hit. About a minute later, the group finished their fight. Not taking any time to relax, they quickly turned to give Lex aid, and froze. The craven lay there, collapsed on the ground, grunting like its mind had been fractured, while Lex stood casually beside it. The slight sweat that covered his body did not make him look exhausted, but rather was a testament to how little he had exerted himself. The char from the flame that burned his chest covered his body, hiding how pale he really was, and instead made him look like a man who had walked out of hell fire. Neither his shield nor his sword were anywhere in sight, but the way the craven kept wailing gave the impression that he had used his bare hands to bring the creature to its current state. Even more impressive was the fact that none of the spiritual attacks in the craven's voice did anything to Lex as he just stood there casually next to it. Quenhild had studied in great detail all the rumors about Lex, and came to the conclusion that while true, they had been somewhat embellished. Now though, she could not help but believe. In fact, at this moment, he even seemed somewhat greater than his rumors. Ness was gravely injured. In fact, she had to sit still and let Sylvia heal her, or there was a strong chance she would go into shock. But as she stared at the man standing beside humanity's greatest foe, she had to remind herself not to move, for she found herself filled with lust. To be more specific, she was filled with lust for battle. Lex had been hiding his capabilities, and her heart was filled with the greatest desire to find out to what degree. Baron was pale, and not just because of his blood loss. He disliked and picked on Lex to show his superiority, so as to let Lex know his place in the competition from Quenhild. But all he was good for was defending and running away, so never felt seriously threatened. But now he felt threatened. "What are you waiting for?" Lex asked, waking everyone up from their reverie. "Kill the craven and take the realm. It's best not to let these things wait, lest something unexpected happens." As if listening to Lex, Quenhild dashed to him and pierced the craven through its back towards its core. Her glaive, like always, cut smoothly through all opposition and abruptly ended the creature's life. There was a sense of disbelief that filled the air as the creature fell limp onto the ground, no longer grunting or moving. That was it? But apparently, it seemed so. Quenhild paused to look at the craven's body, but could not find a single external wound. She looked towards Lex and saw tired eyes and a nosebleed, nothing else. It seemed she had still underestimated Lex. She wanted to talk to him, but his words were right. It was best to finish things quickly lest anything else unexpected happened. Lex saw her turn towards the blue flame and excitement surged within him. He wondered how much energy he would get. Then, a familiar sense of danger filled his body. Before he could react in any way, though, at a speed incomprehensible to him, a figure appeared in front of him and placed a single finger on his forehead. Lex felt the cold finger press against him, unable to tell if the sensation was actual temperature or his instincts warning him about death. Yet nothing else happened. The world seemed to have frozen and his body alongside it, with only his thoughts remaining unfrozen. He focused towards the figure and realized two things. First, this was the same figure he had seen earlier, back in the first ruins. Second, standing in front of him was a member of the crystal race, and he was far stronger than anything Lex could go up against. "Do not be alarmed, young human," spoke a warm voice inside his head. "I only came to talk to you. I found your fight quite interesting. But more importantly, I was fascinated by the questions you asked." Chapter 310 Focal Point. Lex relaxed considerably, though there was just something about having a finger on his forehead that could drill into his brain at any moment that didn't let him feel completely at ease. He looked at the stranger in front of him. Besides a small gap around his eyes that showed the figure was made of crystal with a blue tint in it, he was covered in wrappings from head to toe. All it would take was a pair of sunglasses, and no one would ever be able to tell the figure was from the crystal race, and would mistake him for a human. He also noticed that by commenting on the fact that he liked Lex's questions to the craven, he revealed that he could understand whatever language they had been speaking. Yet, the craven had clearly stated that his language could not be understood by inferior races. This either meant that he was lying, which was completely possible, or that the crystal race did not fall into the category of an inferior race. Do you know the answers? Do you know where the craven came from? Lex asked with excitement in his voice. It was a lot harder to mask his emotions when the conversation was taking place in his own brain. The man laughed before answering. Of course I know the answers, and more. In fact, the reason I'm in this realm to begin with is to erase any evidence or historical records that are not for common eyes. Lex tried to analyze his words, but the man did not give away any details. All he had managed to convey so far was that the origin of the craven, or perhaps their goals, may not be such a mystery to everyone. This man at least knew the answers, but wanted to avoid spreading the information. I'll give you a few hints though, if you're interested in searching for the answers. Matters relating to the craven are more complicated than you realize. At the same time, however, those that need to know about these matters, do. So, there are two ways for you to learn the answers you seek. First, you become important enough to the people who know that they share this knowledge with you. Who they are, and how you can become important to them, I will leave for you to figure out on your own. Second, you find old ruins like the ones in this realm, but in an area that has been long forgotten. After all, any time a new minor realm is opened, someone like me comes along to scrub the place clean. And any ruins back in the crystal realm that are common knowledge have already been scrubbed clean. The only way for you to learn the truth through this method is to find a realm, or some ruins, on your own that no one else knows about. For a moment, Lex did not respond as he thought about the information given to him. In the end, he could not stop himself from asking, if this information is meant to be kept a secret, why are you telling me how to find it? Why else? Because I think it will be entertaining. If you're able to learn the truth, you can find me in a city called Valesco to share the story of how you found out. If I like the story, for every secret you uncovered, I'll reveal another one. But I think you're still far away from that for now, so I'll give you a little help to speed up the process. The crown that the little girl is carrying around is called the Isle garb. It is useless to humans, unless they happen to follow what you call the true path of cultivation. The crystal winked at Lex as he said that. Next, a small tip about minor realms. Minor realms are a tear in space and so are exposed to a lot of chaotic energy, also known as radiation. If a minor realm is naturally formed, this chaotic energy will soon cause the realm to collapse, but if a minor realm is created, the creator naturally equips the realm with a way to harness the radiation, and spread it throughout the realm as spiritual energy. Some of it, however, is saved up in an area known as the focal point, which is a treasure that can be used to influence the realm. If someone were to enter an unowned realm, and take control of the focal point, they can absorb all that energy. It's a safe way to quickly raise your cultivation. The man winked again. After all that excess energy is absorbed, the cultivator can still cultivate much faster, so long as they do so near the focal point. Of course, it can't compete with taking a new focal point, but, typically, a person can only own one focal point at a time. The man paused after that, almost as if considering if he wanted to give Lex a few more hints to help him, but in the end, decided not to make it too easy for Lex. I'll leave you with a letter. If you want to find me, just give that letter to one of the guards in Valesco. With that the man vanished, as if he had never been there, and time seemed to flow again. Quenhild was still walking towards the blue flame while the rest of the group was either healing or inspecting the dead craven. In Lex's hand was a sealed letter with no name or destination written on any side. He put away the letter and took a deep breath of relief. Then he thought over the new information the man had given him. So other than absorb the abundant energy in the realms into the system, he could absorb it himself and speed up his cultivation. This was good news, because it meant that all minor realms would have a massive amount of energy stored up. While Quenhild did whatever she needed to do with the flame, Lex walked towards the dead assassins. Their demise had not been peaceful, as almost all of them had their bodies split in half, while others had been crushed or burned to death. Lex removed their masks but, as expected, did not recognize any of them. He searched their bodies but, other than their weapons, they carried nothing else that may reveal their origins. Find anything? Jovi asked, limping up to Lex. Not a thing, he replied impassively. In Lex's mind, he was already planning his next move. The chances that these assassins were after him was extremely slim, and he was sure Quenhild would get to the bottom of it, so he already put it out of his mind. I can probably guess their origin, said Jovi as he looked around, making sure no one was close. I can tell you, but you have to answer a question of mine first. Lex raised an eyebrow as he looked at Jovi with curiosity. Intrigued, he said, ask away. What kind of relationship do you have with Quenhild? Lex almost felt stupid for being curious. All that build-up, and what was it for? Petty jealousy? Did he think they had a romantic relationship or something? Strictly professional. My designated profession at the academy is survival consultant, and based on my performance during a previous expedition, she thought I would be of assistance and hired me. Jovi let out a breath of relief, and then actually laughed, for he didn't even realize he had been holding his breath. I'm sorry, after you, the craven. Jovi stopped and chuckled at his state. He collected his thoughts and asked, are you familiar with the distinctions between academy students? By profession? No, not like that. Let me explain. The academy, as you probably know it, is a tool used by the king to train the leaders in every possible industry from the entire Hum nation. Its campus, as you've probably noticed, is ridiculously huge. That's because the academy covers more land than entire provinces such as Bristol. I'm not sure how many students the academy has at any one point, but last year, 30 billion students graduated from the academy. After they graduate, those students are sent throughout the realm and assume roles that help their respective communities in massive ways. But, all of that is just the most basic and out level of the academy. These students are, in a way, probationary students. Only by achieving something extraordinary, before you graduate, can you become eligible to become a true student. Another way of putting it would be that, only after you prove yourself, can you become a core student of the academy. He paused, and turned to look at Quenhild. She's been proving herself for a while now, and once she gains this minor realm, she'll be eligible to become a core student. I'm guessing, the assassins were sent by someone who's competing with her for that position. Chapter 311 Cursed System. Is there a quota on how many core students there can be? Lex asked, curiously. No, there's no quota. But there's only so many things you can do that count towards getting you a spot as a core student that are as easy as taking control of a minor realm. There will be a lot of minor realms, and the fight for the focal point for each of them will be intense. We are probably the first ones to actually reach a focal point, all thanks to you and Patrick sensing the energy signatures. Most others will probably spend weeks scouring the realms for it. He paused for a moment, looked at Lex, then continued. The real prize Quenhild is after is not this minor realm, despite how valuable it is. It's the admission into the core of the academy. And when she becomes a member, she can nominate 5 people to come along with her. They won't be core members themselves, but they'll still be better than normal students. Realization dawned on Lex, and he understood now why Jovi had asked about his relationship with Quenhild. He probably also understood the animosity Baron had towards him. The group was full of competitors, and everyone wanted to be the one Quenhild nominated. What actually happens when you become a core disciple? Lex asked, curiously. If the benefits were worth it, he would consider it as well. After all, he had plans on absorbing energy from the other minor realms, anyway. He didn't mind claiming one if the benefits were worth it. He'd also thought of claiming the minor realms for himself if possible, but if that opportunity arose, he'd already thought of an alternative that suited him more. What happens once you've become a core student is a closely guarded matter. Quenhild may know a bit, but mostly it is kept secret. What is commonly known, however, is that every student who enters goes through explosive growth. But, most importantly, almost 30% of core students end up becoming immortals. Jovi became out of breath as he said the last sentence, and his eyes widened with longing. Even Lex paused his thoughts, then shook his head. Higher realms were not his focus right now. He needed energy, and that's where his focus lay. The process of taking control of the focal point was not quick, and it actually took a few hours before Quenhild finished. As unfortunate as it was, as soon as she did, she ended up absorbing all the accumulated energy. Somehow, the loss of the energy hurt Lex more than the severe burns on his chest and the poison still coursing through his veins. With the realm under her control now, the blue flame died out. But instead of the realm falling into darkness, an orb of gentle yellow light appeared in the sky, illuminating the lands. She did not pay attention to the change in lighting, and instead the first thing Quenhild did was give Lex a complicated look full of wonder, gratitude, and admiration. "It's done, the minor realm is under my control. I'll take you all back to get treated, and then we can discuss payment and the next steps after everyone is healed. But first, let's get rid of all those treasure hunters snooping around my new realm." No one protested, for everyone needed medical aid, but they all looked at one another with complicated eyes. Lex especially received the most looks of envy and jealousy. Quenhild placed a hand on top of the dish in which the fire was lit and, after a moment, let out a sigh of relief. "It's done, and the timing couldn't be better." Some people were actually trying to break the barrier to the sleeping crystals. "Anyway, let's get out of here." Instead of a portal opening up for them to walk though, like last time, Lex was directly with the strange yet familiar feeling of the disconnect between his body and his consciousness. But having already experienced it once, Lex handled it like a pro. A moment later, he was back in the familiar setting of Quenhild's apartment. A team of doctors and emergency responders were already waiting for them and quickly swarmed the group. Those who were in the worst conditions were immediately taken away while the slightly less injured were given support while the doctors examined them directly where they stood. While Lex could also use medical attention, there was something slightly more urgent to take care of. Under the horrified gaze of the doctor who was looking at the massive cauterized wounds on Lex's chest, he signaled Quenhild to meet him on the side. "How are you doing?" she asked, now that she could better see his condition. The nonchalance on his face earlier had fooled her into thinking he took on no injuries, but seeing the fact that he had simply been ignoring his wounds worried her. From their voice to their ridiculous strength to the poisonous slime, everything about Craven was designed to kill. In a way, surviving with injuries was more impressive than not getting injured at all. "I have a request, a favor and business proposition for you," Lex said, after considering his words. "I'll start with the request. I'd like to replace my payment with the crown you're carrying." "This?" Quenhild asked, holding up the crown that had been hung around her waist, surprised. They'd had the crown for many days, which had given her plenty of time to experiment with it, but she had discovered nothing special. She'd even worn it, and besides acting as a beautiful headpiece, it seemed to offer nothing else. "Do you know what it does?" "I know a little about it," Lex said, without elaborating. Quenhild shrugged and handed it over, without much consideration. As valuable as it might be, it could not compete with the hundreds of actual sleeping crystals in her realm, and Lex had helped tremendously. He more than earned it. "Take it as a bonus for beating the Craven on your own, and expect your payment in full. We cooperated well. I hope we'll be able to do so again in the future, / Much appreciated," he said without being pedantic. "Now, for the request. As you know, I still plan on visiting other minor realms, but I don't want to waste too much time healing. At the same time, I can't afford to go if I'm not in top condition. I need to speed up my recovery as much as possible, and I'm guessing you'd have access to better facilities than anywhere else. If you could help me out, I'd greatly appreciate it." "Consider it done," Quenhild said. Even if she didn't believe Lex was her half-brother, he had proved himself extremely valuable and she would have wanted to maintain an excellent relationship with him. If she could use something as simple as resources to win over his favor, she'd consider it a bargain. But it still won't be a miraculous recovery. First, the doctors will need to check your condition to figure out the extent of your injuries, and based on that, we can move forward." "Not a problem." Finally, the business proposal. "So I was thinking." As Lex explained his plan to her, she gave him a befuddled look, which then fluctuated between absolute disgust and amazement. If he could pull off what he was thinking, it would be the most broken way to earn money she had ever encountered. She had to be a part of this. Osaka, Japan, Earth. Suda Ito slowly wiped the blood from his katana, ignoring the dozens of dismembered bodies around him. A faint smell of death had begun to envelope the area, but the coming storm clouds should wash away the stain of his sins. In the distance, a crowd had gathered as they watched, horrified but at the same time, numbed. For a time, while the Council of New Order ruled Earth, Suda had purged Japan of all external influence, and taken control. The fact that every time he overcame an obstacle, or killed a strong opponent, his system would give him generous rewards was in fact just a bonus to him. The people of Japan had long since become used to his ruthlessness and brutality. Most looked at him with disgust and hate, though they did their best to hide it. Some formed a zealous cult, worshipping his actions of bringing Japan back to its roots. What no one knew was that, deep inside, this was not what he wanted. Suda had lived a simple life before receiving the samurai system, and lived in a small town. His ambitions extended as far as retiring his parents and starting a family, and nothing more. When he received his system, instead of glory and wonder, it brought him hell. The reason was simple. The samurai system made him incredibly strong, and as a system that directly increased his strength and combat abilities, made it so that there was no danger he could not face. But it came with one great flaw. In the old days, samurais were retainers under their feudal lords. Similarly now, as a samurai, his system made him unquestionably loyal to his feudal lord. Unfortunately, through a twist of fate, he had pledged his loyalty to an extremely ambitious man who, while ignorant of the system, understood full well how to take advantage of Suda's strength. This man, who went only by the name Suzuki, had tasted the power of ruling, before Fernando retook control of the earth and stabilized everything. Now though, he spent all his time venting his anger on the weak, through Suda, of course. "Come Suda," the extremely well-dressed man said as he walked away from the bloody scene, even less bothered by the surrounding gore. "We have a new commission, someone named Larry, who's been hiding at the Midnight Inn. For now though, we'll only collect information on the target. I've heard security is very tight at the inn." Suda said nothing, and followed Suzuki, his expression indifferent. He had learned to hide his emotions from his lord. Until he found a way to regain his freedom from this cursed system, he needed to hide as much as he could. Chapter 312 Error. Lex sat cross-legged, wearing an oxygen mask in a tube of a viscous green liquid. His recovery was a lot slower this time around, considering the fact that the lotus on his back wasn't helping. In the first place, it had helped last time due to a misunderstanding, and Lex didn't want to ask it for help again unless the situation was dire. Thus, he was stuck at the mercy of this healing liquid. The greatest obstacle to his recovery was the poison in his blood. As he expected, his body was very resistant to the effects of the poison, but resistant was not the same as immune. Fortunately, if there was one thing that humans were well prepared for, it was anything related to cravens. The green liquid was not exactly comfortable to sit in and caused Lex's body to itch all over. But, for the sake of a swift recovery, he bore the inconvenience in silence, and instead turned his attention towards the inn. The first stage of Lady Cosmos finally ended, and a mere 400,000 contestants would move on to the next stage. This phase of the competition was filled with trials that contestants had to complete in small teams. Lex had given Mary 5 million MP to help Audrey form any kind of trial she wanted, and a short glance at the venue showed them clearing some kind of life-sized maze that required ingenuity and teamwork. The size of the audience for Lady Cosmos had not decreased with the number of contestants, but had rather increased vastly. For the first time, Lex noticed a couple of Earth immortals amongst his guests at the inn. They were not mixed in with the crowd, but rented entire small villages and stayed there with their followers. They could not be considered his average guests, but he needed to upgrade the inn to better cater to them as well. Another aspect of the inn he was concerned about was security. Things had finally stabilized. This did not mean that there were no incidents, but that the frequency of incidents stabilized and that the hired security was working well with the inn's own security to handle things smoothly. In fact, it was while he was monitoring his guards that he noticed something strange. One of the security room's functions was picking up on malicious intent, either towards the inn or even its guests. This feature allowed them to often prevent an incident from taking place and was one of the main reasons that the inn had managed to keep the peace. After all, more than once, a guest had approached one of the contestants from Lady Cosmos with the intention to harass or blackmail, and they had been dealt with swiftly. It was this feature that picked up a certain pair spying on Larry, with the intention of collecting information on him, and harming him once he left the inn. Since they had done nothing wrong, they were not punished, but Chad, Gerard's deputy, sent a few guards their way to advise them to honor their guests' privacy. This was very routine, and Lex would have forgotten the incident the moment he looked away, but while he was scanning them, he saw something that he had actually forgotten about. Of the pair, one had an unusual status. Name and %error %and. Age and %error %and. Sex and %error %and. Cultivation details and %error %and. Midnight and prestige level 1. Remarks: this man is pouting with his eyes. Maybe some Saturn cake will cheer him up and form an addiction that will keep him coming back for more. Lex frowned as he recalled the last few times he had seen an error message with his scan. First was his unofficial employee, John, and second was the Celestial, who was his bodyguard. They had been enigmatic figures with a mysterious past and unknown origin, so he would understand it if there was something unusual about them that eluded the system. After all, the system had proven that it was not perfect, and there were many loopholes in its functionality. But Lex had seen enough anime to recognize Japanese when he heard it, even if it was automatically being translated for him. So now the question was, what did these three have in common that could elude the system's scan? Or did they each have separate reasons for avoiding the scan's results? Mary, I want you to keep a close eye on that guest, he said, pointing towards Suda. I want you to collect all the information on him and save it for me. While you're at it, compile all the information we have on John, as well as my bodyguard, during the midnight games. Lex made a mental note to consider the cause before turning his attention to other matters. The group of workers he'd hired earlier to plan and design the village had submitted their first report, and Lex took a look at it. They had proposed many additions to the village, but had also suggested some changes to the already existing design as well. They studied areas with highest and lowest density of guests and tracked their movements, as well as analyzed why those were more or less popular areas for guests. Things such as attractions, restaurants, parks, and residential areas were generally high-density areas, but some were more than others. The reason was the easier flow of traffic. All of Lex's designs had an air of Earth about them, but the best or most common forms of traffic flow were not necessarily the best for other demographics. The plan they proposed was only the first step in overhauling the entire village, this being only the first because they wanted to study how the changes affected the flow and distribution of guests. The first change was a major one. Lex, in his pursuit to make the village seem as if it had grown and expanded organically, had placed the various districts slightly haphazardly. The planners proposed small but significant alterations that would make it easier to have a network of roads and paths connected to each area, while at the same time organizing each area into smaller sub-districts. Furthermore, rather than tile walking paths or usual roads, different species of grass were used to mark different paths. A network of canals was also added alongside these roads in many districts, linking them to the underwater portion of the village. Moreover, transport through only subways or golf carts and such was also distinctly Earth-like, and entirely unnecessary. All transport vehicles were designated an aerial level, and would not obstruct the crowds on the ground. From various silent pods, to booths on ground that would levitate once occupied, to entire small tram-like cabins, became the main mode of transport. Not only were they extremely quick and silent, through clever use of formations, the level at which all of these vehicles would be traveling became almost invisible, revealing their existence only when focused on. The random clutter of the city suddenly seemed to take on a more organized look and feel. The massive features of the village, such as the Colosseum or giant pagoda, were no longer intrusions, but rather attractions, becoming sufficiently distanced from residential and recreational areas. Impressed by the detail of their proposal, Lex decided to implement all of it, the complete changes only costing him 3 million MP. Considering the fact that Lex now had 1.1 billion MP, he considered it pocket change. Next, he looked at the changes they suggested for the floating portion of the village. They believed that keeping the floating portion stationary was a waste, and proposed to turn it into an independent district of the village that could move through the air over the village. Not only that, the floating village would play an integral role in controlling the climate of the village down below. They replaced the former method of arrival to the floating village and instead created a few terminals through which guests would be brought or taken away. They also reduced the use of glass, and instead added greater elements of nature, making it seem like a paradise, hiding in the clouds. All kinds of birds made their homes here, so an orchard was also added, which would become the designated spot for wildlife. Lex once again approved all the suggestions without any alterations, and, with a snap of his fingers, the system started implementing the changes. The guests were initially alarmed, but then watched in awe as the village moved around them, improving right under their eyes. The frequent guests took the changes in their stride, but the millions of new guests observed in awe. Some of the workers revealed that this was the work of the enigmatic innkeeper that none of them had seen, and they all began to wonder what kind of a figure this innkeeper was. The immortals especially were alarmed. It was not every day they encountered a sight that could amaze them. Chapter 313 Right on the nose. It took nearly 8 hours for the poison to be cleansed from Lex's body. He wasn't completely healed by the time that was done, but he was well enough that he exited the tube to complete some of his other tasks. During this previous expedition, though he had a sword, he had not ended up using it even once. He had practiced using it a little, but the matter of fact was that he was nowhere near competent enough to use it skillfully. Heck, he had only been a cultivator less than a year, or a little more. He had lost track of time, but he had been so busy during that time that something like training methodically and systematically was impossible. He had gotten better with his gun, but only because his enhanced senses made using it simple. The amount of time he had trained was minuscule. As such, for now at least, carrying such a weapon was not feasible for him. Perhaps later, when he had the time to train, he would come back to it. Now, though, he decided to go even simpler. He made his way to the weaponsmith who he previously used to work for and used his newfound wealth to purchase a pair of black gloves. Other than providing basic protection for his hands, the gloves provided him with a series of benefits due to their enchantments. The gloves conducted spiritual energy, and so would not get in the way of his array casting, while another enchantment would stabilize his hands and fingers to help his precision while drawing characters. It also had a simple yet powerful shockwave ability. Lex could store spiritual energy into it and activate it while hitting something to launch the shockwaves. He also bought new armor and gear. He no longer lived with the delusion that either the armor or gear would serve him for long, so he went for items with greater immediate benefits rather than that could serve him long term. After all, it was all too common for him to lose or break whatever gear he had. He still couldn't get over the loss of his fancy monocle. With that done, he returned to Quenhild. While he was recovering, she had submitted the report of her success, as well as the numerous sleeping crystals in her new realm. Even the admin for the academy had been startled by the news. An investigation was ongoing, and this would most likely turn into a bargaining chip for the academy with the crystal race. It was not easy to earn their favor, and so they would be sure to make the best use of this opportunity. Suffice to say, once her realm was thoroughly explored, and the scope of her situation was understood, Quenhild would be appropriately rewarded. Entrance into the core of the academy was all but guaranteed for her at this point. Of course, she had also silently and secretly sent information about this event to her mother. Who knew, maybe this could prompt the woman to even come back to the academy, which was something Quenhild would have enjoyed. After all, there were certain things she could only do with her mother around. Quenhild's ambitions were no less than her mother's. Of course, none of that had anything to do with Lex. What he was after was something else entirely. This is the list of minor realms with Foundation realm-only designations, Quenhild said, as she handed Lex a list. A detailed report of what's happening inside is hard to get, as currently the only source of information is the students who have left. There is one, however, that I think fits your criteria well, though I personally am not so sure about it. It has the highest chances that no one has gotten even close to figuring out where the focal point is because the realm is overrun by imps. And when I say overrun, I'm being modest. Tens of thousands of imps occupy this realm, all part of various warring clans that, I assume, usually fight each other, but as soon as the students appeared they all attacked them immediately. There have been dozens of casualties confirmed, with hundreds of missing students, presumed dead or captured. There's a massive battle that's been going on for the past few hours between students and thousands of imps. It is by far the most chaotic realm so far. Ah, such terrible news, so many innocent students coming to harm. I suppose it is my responsibility to go and end their suffering by taking over the realm and ejecting them from whatever prisons the imps have kept them in. Quenhild gave him a bland look, as if she was not at all impressed by his humor. Lex chuckled and said, "Don't worry, just have a buyer ready for me by the time I come back." "You're sure there are no reports of cravens in the realm? Or any other golden core creatures?" "No, that craven was an anomaly that the Academy is looking into. Such a thing should not happen. As for other golden core creatures, that's entirely possible. In such matters, as long as the disadvantage is not overwhelming, the Academy does not interfere." "But Lex, are you really sure you want to do this alone? You've experienced firsthand how difficult it was to claim a realm." "Don't worry. Even if I can't get this one, I'm sure I can manage at least one. As for going alone, I think it's for the best. No one will be looking for or expecting a lone person to take a realm. Besides, if I don't need to worry about warning others about danger all the time, and only have to look after myself, I'll be much faster." Quenhild did not argue. She did not believe in being pedantic, and showing concern for his well-being once was already uncharacteristic for her usual self. Besides, Lex's business proposal of capturing realms, and then instead of reporting it to the Academy, selling them to students who are pursuing the core of the Academy was an extremely lucrative idea. It was madness, to be honest. Who would value money over getting to the core of the Academy? Lex, apparently. If anything, it seemed he thought of it as an inconvenience to avoid. She shook her head and then signaled one of her attendants. An Academy administrator came into the room and, after being informed of which one, opened a portal for Lex to the realm. By going to the realms from Quenhild's apartment instead of the public entrances, they could better hide their movements. After all, if the Academy registered the achievement of claiming a realm under Lex's name, the value of selling the realm would diminish drastically. Lex was all too familiar with the sensation of passing through a portal by now, and took it in his stride. He was looking forward to the next few days. He had been planning on going to minor realms in search of energy reserves anyway, but now he could gain double the benefits. The moment he arrived in the minor realm, however, a massive hammer the size of a car door smashed him directly in the face. It happened too fast for him to even sense, let alone dodge. His body was thrown in the air, but the disorientation lasted only a moment, and he gathered himself before he even landed. He didn't even need to glance around to realize that he had arrived right in the middle of a massive battle. Lex crashed into a few imps, and while the force of the crash severely damaged them, Lex quickly hopped onto his feet to look around. Hundreds of students were fighting against thousands of imps, as well as trolls. Lex was already familiar with these two races, as he had studied them in his classes. Imps and trolls were both humanoid creatures, but drastically different in size. Imps were usually around 3 feet, (0.9 meters) in size, and were feral creatures with only basic intelligence. They were, however, feral in nature and carriers of various diseases. Trolls were usually anywhere between 8 to 12 feet, (2.4 to 3.7 meters) in size and were even dumber, making them easily manipulated by the imps. They boasted mild immunity to spiritual energy and great physical strength. Still, the academy students were not pushovers, and the numerical disadvantage did not deter them. Yet the fight was a wild skirmish, with each doing whatever they saw fit, which only served to increase the chaos. Lex paid no attention to any of that, though. Masterfully dodging any attacks coming his way, he rubbed his nose that had taken the brunt of that hammer, and waited for the Lotus to tell him about any nearby energy reserves. He was not disappointed, and as soon as he got a direction, he used Heart's Marathon to bolster his speed and ran off. The one thing he had learned while helping Quenhild was that, as long as he only faced those in the Foundation realm, he had little to fear. That's what gave him his confidence in trying to claim multiple realms. Now, he had to put his skills to the test. Origin Realm, Pendal Galactic Battlefront. Ragnar's command carrier did not alter its paths as it tore through asteroids bigger than Earth, though it had begun to slow down. 6 other command carriers were stationed on the border of this battlefront, a void without any stars, let alone star systems and planets. Only an endless field of rocks and desolation as far as the eye could see, with no indication of what this region had once been. This would be the first time, in a long time, that Ragnar would face an enemy other than demons. But just as that was a war he had to face, so too was this. But, unlike the clash humans had against devils, which was personal, this battlefield was one they were obligated to fight in, so long as they took advantage of the Henali conventions. Somewhere else in the command carrier, a tired Alexander looked out into space. The former golden child of destiny was now not but an exhausted soldier. Yet, hidden deep in his eyes was a fire that burned brighter than the stars. So long as he was alive, the universe had not beaten him. Chapter 314 Flow. When the command carrier appeared close enough to the battlefront, Ragnar retreated to his private chambers and enabled all the security measures the room came with. Soon he heard the sound of a notification he was waiting for and sat down on a throne in the center of his room. When he sat, his surroundings seemed to change, and he was no longer in his room, but instead he found himself in a cave, facing several other men sitting in similar thrones. This was not holographic projection, the throne had special enchantments that only he could activate, which would lead him to a nearby minor realm, temporarily formed just for the purpose of holding secret meetings. Only other generals of the Jotun Empire had access to such thrones, or those with authority even superior to the generals. This was because every word they spoke had major repercussions on the entire empire, and no chances could be taken for their conversations to be overheard. Even their casual conversations required sufficient authority for one to hear. "Oh my, we have the honor of Hell's Butcher joining us today. Don't tell me the devils have decided to interfere here as well," said one of the 6 other men in the hall teasingly. "You must remember, he is not just a butcher," said another one. When his rank was raised to general, His Highness Serafal called him Son of the Empire. Where the Empire has a need, the Son will appear to fulfill it. But that does not bode well for us. Ragnar only smiled mildly while the other generals joked about. Even the youngest of them were tens of thousands of years older than him. He, at a mere 3,500 years, was one of the youngest generals in the entire empire. Furthermore, he always had a soft spot for other humans. His ferocity would usually be reserved for demons and devils, or any of the other races that targeted humans. Now, among his peers in rank and strength, Ragnar did not mind filling the role of being the younger brother. "This is no time for joking about," a harsh voice cut through the cave. A man walked in from the darkness, his face locked in a stern expression even as he spoke. All generals recognized this being, for it was no man but the spirit body of a sentient treasure that was stored in the center of the Pendal galaxy. "Now that Ragnar is finally here, I can begin your briefing. Things have changed, and drastically. While it seems that everything has been as usual on the battlefront, we've gotten reports of anomalies. Within the last 5 years, over 300 star systems just outside the quarantine zone have mysteriously been destroyed. The battlefront was actually a specific zone just at the border of their galaxy, where this war was fought. What was happening beyond this border, or in the galaxy opposite to them, was none of their concern. Their only job was to ensure their so-called enemies did not sneak into their galaxy. It was not easy, but at least it was not complicated since their enemies would only come from a specific region of space, so there was no threat of being backstabbed. Outside the battlefront was a quarantine zone, which was a no-development zone, in case the battle ever spread to those regions. Yet now there was trouble right outside the quarantine zone. Typically, it should not have been possible for anyone to sneak past them. Which meant there were two most likely possibilities: either their enemies had somehow gotten reinforcements, which were gearing up to attack the generals from the back and front, or that they had discovered a method to sneak past them. Whichever one it was bad for them. "It gets worse," the man said, his expression somehow becoming even more grave. "We suspect they're nurturing a Jorlum." All 6 generals stood up from their thrones, shock and a hint of fear showing in their eyes, Ragnar included. A Jorlum was an absolutely massive creature born in space, such that the average star would be smaller than its eyeball. They were so extremely, ridiculously rare, that in the entire history of the Jotun Empire, let alone encountering one, even rumors of a living one had not been heard. If the enemy was nurturing one, that meant it had already been born, and that was already too dangerous. The entire Pendal galaxy was at risk of being destroyed. "We need proof of the Jorlum before we can ask for aid from the Henali Alliance, but not only do we have no idea where it might be hiding, we have no way to get close without being detected." A heavy silence filled the cave while everyone absorbed the information, and were waiting for the spirit body to continue, when suddenly, Ragnar had an idea. "I may have a solution," Ragnar said, attracting disbelieving looks not only from his peers, but from the spirit body as well. "News has probably not spread to you all, so first let me update you on my most recent assignment. There is an inn." Escaping from the battlefield was actually harder than Lex expected, though it was mostly due to the difficult terrain. Towards the edge of the battle, the ground turned soft and malleable, but his foot didn't actually sink in. The ground itself would stretch under the weight of his body. It was like running on elastic rubber. In the end, he didn't even bother avoiding attacks, because they did next to no harm. He just focused on maintaining his balance and getting away. This minor realm was extremely desolate, even away from the battle. He had yet to see any vegetation of any kind, and so he could only imagine what the imps and trolls used for sustenance. Instead, he saw unusual landscapes and terrains that made no sense. Currently he was standing at the base of a mountain range, except, unlike a normal mountain range that would extend across the land, this one was shaped like an upside-down pyramid and rose into the sky. Out of one mountain grew 3 that rose vertically, and out of those, 3 more grew out, and so on. The strange thing was that the base of each mountain was extremely small, and instead grew wider the higher it rose into the sky. Stranger still was that, considering the massive structure filling up the sky, it should be extremely dark where Lex stood, but it wasn't. Each of the mountains was covered in crystals that refracted light so perfectly, sending beams of light to other crystals, which then spread the light even further, that it was as bright as midday. He did not even try to understand how this formation came about, or whether it was natural or artificial. He just identified his path towards the energy source, which was somewhere in this range. To be clear, he wouldn't have to climb the mountains vertically. There were roads carved into the mountain sides just like one would see in any mountain that suffered from a flow of traffic. Once he got a good idea of where he was headed, he didn't embark immediately. Although he had confidence in his defense and other abilities, there was nothing wrong with being fully prepared. Which brought his attention to the crown hanging by his waist. He held it in his hands and observed it. As far as appearance was concerned, it was wholly unremarkable. There were no gems or intricate designs. It was a simple gold band with a few ridges throughout. But the function mattered more than appearance. He channeled his spiritual energy into it, but nothing seemed to happen. The energy circled through the crown and entered back into his body. The fact that the energy was able to seamlessly re-enter his body was unusual, but not enough to be of any use. The crystal man he had met earlier told him those following the true path could use it, so maybe he had to wear it to actually use it. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully set the crown on his head. A gentle current of spiritual energy flowed around him as it was absorbed into his body, then directed towards the crown. A few moments later, the crown vibrated and activated. Lex's senses merged with the crown as if it weren't a piece of jewelry but rather a part of his body. He could feel the crown act as an external meridian wrapped around his forehead with a stream of spiritual energy constantly flowing through it. But, most importantly, Lex felt a familiar, yet somehow foreign sensation overcome him. He entered a state of flow. It had been a long time since he naturally entered that state of flow, and he could immediately tell the difference between the state induced by the crown and the natural one. He had not yet entered the flow since he entered the foundation realm, but he suspected that the benefits it had on him would have increased manifold. Comparatively, this artificial state still calmed his mind, accelerated his thoughts and helped him gain remarkably precise control over his body more than he used to back when he was in the chi training realm at least, but he was all too aware that it was artificial. This would be extremely helpful to him in forming arrays quickly, as well as boost the effects of his instincts as well. However, Lex was not focused on the benefits he had gained. Instead, he began to wonder what this state of flow really was. After all, he assumed this crown was an incredibly special tool based on the emphasis it received in the chamber they took it from. It was a great piece of equipment that could only be used by the crystal race and those on the true path, and yet, it could only provide a pale imitation of something Lex had achieved naturally, albeit, he could not turn it on as and when he wished. It must really be something special. He would have to put it to the test. Chapter 315 Mental Clarity. Taking even steps, Lex walked slowly up the path on the mountain, the fingers of his left hand dragging against the wall in the path cut into the mountainside. At his current pace, it would take Lex years to reach the focal point, but his mind was not on that. Instead, currently, he was doing multiple things at the same time. The state of flow was remarkable, and gave Lex the mental clarity he needed to sort out various matters, as well as notice many things he had overlooked. The first thing he noticed, though he could not really blame himself for this, was that due to how busy he had been, Lex had made no progress at all in his cultivation. Lex felt great satisfaction in his achievements so far, and at his amazing performance in general, but he had only just stepped onto the starting line of the foundation realm. His performance would improve exponentially so long as his cultivation also improved. But for that Lex needed time he didn't have, so he directly dismissed the thought. The second thing he noticed was a peculiarity of regal embrace. It was excellent at helping him learn defensive techniques, but caused him great issues if he tried to learn offensive techniques. Yet it gave him no benefits or obstacles when he was performing either defensive or offensive arrays. The difference was that arrays were not fueled by his own spiritual energy despite being drawn using it, which is where the influence of regal embrace vanished. This helped him determine that his spiritual energy had certain behavior. But what was the underlying cause in the difference in behavior? It wasn't like the cultivation technique could read his mind to determine what kind of technique he was using, or else he could just say he's learning a defensive technique while learning attacks. After all, self-hypnosis was a thing. That meant there was something on a fundamental level about the makeup of these techniques that he did not know about that influenced how his spiritual energy behaved. If he could figure out what that was, he could overcome the obstacle of his techniques. A simple analogy of the situation could be made using magnets. If Lex had two magnets in his hand, and wanted to join them, but kept trying to do so by pushing the north pole of each magnet towards one another, he would face great resistance. Yet the same situation could easily be resolved if just used the opposite pole for one of the magnets. The situation with Lex's techniques was no doubt much more complex than simply swapping poles, but as long as he understood the difference, he would be able to channel the speed at which he learned defensive techniques into all other kinds of techniques. This, again, was a topic that required a lot of time to conduct research, and so Lex pushed it to the back of his mind. The next thing he noticed was his greatest problem with arrays. While drawing one, he could do almost nothing else, and was stuck in place. This made sense, after all, the characters would remain stuck in the place where he drew them, right? that was actually incorrect. If his control over his spiritual energy was enough, he could make an invisible platform on which he could draw the characters. That way, he could control the platform to move with him. This level of multitasking was simple for him in a state of flow, but without it, it was still beyond him. This let him appreciate how truly skilled Alexander was, back when he was fighting in the Midnight Games. He would use different spiritual and body techniques simultaneously. He did not even have the advantage Lex had of being able to use all techniques with the same energy, and would have to make sure to fuel his techniques with the relevant energy. Yet not only was he seamless, he controlled 6 floating blades behind him at the same time as all those techniques. Truly, it was only when you became more familiar with something that you could appreciate the difficulty it involved. But Lex was getting sidetracked. His focus had been on arrays. While drawing, his speed and stability greatly depended on his finger, but did he really need to use his finger like a pen? Instead of moving his finger to draw, couldn't he directly control the spiritual energy to take the relevant shape? That was the experiment he was conducting as he slowly walked. The state of flow was not a miracle, and Lex didn't automatically become able to achieve the task. It did, however, speed up the learning process endlessly. This was all Lex had been doing consciously. That did not, however, mean that Lex did not leave any tasks for his subconscious mind. It occurred to him that so far he had been treating his instincts as a radar for danger, but was that all they were limited to? He hypothesized that it was not so. The concept of identifying danger or a threat signified that his instincts had a sense of self, and could gauge what was good or bad for him. In that case, his instincts should not only react to harmful things, but also notify him if there was something beneficial to him nearby. In simple terms, along with being a radar for danger, his instincts should also work as a radar for treasures that were beneficial to him. It was for this reason that he was running his fingers across the wall. He was using as many of his senses as he could to absorb all the information from the environment. From the toughness of the rock, to the natural grooves formed by different layers of rock, to the temperature, all of it could end up playing a part in guiding him. Everything he did portrayed a lack of urgency, which was the opposite of what he should have been doing, considering he was in a rush to gain the realm. But in the state of flow, Lex had a slightly different perspective. In this state, his emotions were considerably numbed, though not completely, so he felt no anxiety or stress to influence his decision-making. He simply retained his objective and made the necessary decision. As things were, he was already late to this realm by many days. There was a chance that no one had found the focal point yet, but based on the premise of assuming his competitors were extremely competent, it was most likely they had a lead on him. The more this was so, the more Lex had to remain calm. If he rushed, he could easily fall into any traps they had set for following competitors, or give away his position. He also believed that, based on the same premise, if his competitors had not yet taken the focal point, it meant they likely faced some obstruction. It was best to gain a full understanding of the situation before making any decisions. In the end, Lex maintained his slow tempo for a couple of hours, and only sped up when he made decent progress with drawing arrays while walking. By increasing his speed, he also increased the difficulty of drawing the array, but at this point, it was all training for him. The pattern of maintaining a certain speed until he got accustomed to drawing arrays, then speeding up, continued well into the next day. Just as he was due to speed up further and launch into a fast jog, he instead stopped. It happened. His instincts were acting up, and this time instead of danger, it was greed Lex felt. He felt it in his entire body, from his gut to his muscles, down to his very bones. There was something nearby that his body was craving. He took a short break to replenish his stamina before launching into a run. The closer he got, the stronger the sensation became, to the point where his physical desire almost started to interfere with the calm the state of flow provided. At a certain point, he had to step away from the path, and had to climb the mountain with his hands and legs. With the dexterity of a spider, Lex crawled up the mountain until he found a small, hidden tunnel. His body blocked the light from the reflecting crystals as he entered the tunnel, but he didn't really need his sight to guide him. At the opposite end, he exited to a small clearing with a cozy little hut carved into the mountain beside a small fountain. Crystal clear water seemed to drip from the fountain, but evaporated before it could fall to the ground. The hairs on his body stood up and he could feel his body longing for that water. Curious to see what its effects were, he put his hand into the fountain, only to see his hand sucking in the water like a dry sponge. Then his fingers began to turn to stone. Chapter 316 Exhausted. Panic set in, and Lex tried to withdraw his hand, but he was frozen still. He had no choice but to watch as the skin on his hand slowly turned gray, the color cascading up his hand. At the same time, the water from the fountain was quickly being absorbed, and by the time his elbow turned to stone, the fountain was empty. Besides panic, Lex felt immense confusion because the difference between what he was experiencing and what his body was telling him was different. Pure and complete satisfaction filled him to his very core. Before he could think further on the subject, his fingers cracked, and then, as if the stone had been nothing more than an outer layer, it started to fall, revealing his hand, completely unharmed. A moment later, it was as if nothing had happened at all. Lex felt no mystical warmth run down his hand, or noticed any change to his cultivation or anything else. What just happened? Unsure of how to react, almost instinctively, Lex clenched his right hand into a fist and punched the mountain wall. With a loud bang, his fist buried itself directly into the wall. Now Lex was really surprised, because there was no way he was that strong. This entire mountain seemed to be one giant stone, carrying the weight of several other mountains. How could it be so fragile? Yet the evidence was in front of him. He pulled out his hand to find it completely unharmed. He blew on his knuckles, and dust flew off, revealing his unharmed skin. To test things further, he clenched his left hand and punched the wall, to the predictable result of absolutely nothing happening. Let alone crushing through the stone, there was not even a single crack. Excitement gleamed in his eyes as he turned to look at the now dry fountain. Oddly enough, there was no water source, so where had the water been coming from? As if to answer his question, a single, smooth green pebble at the bottom of the fountain spurted out a single drop of water. When he touched the drop, the tip of his finger turned to stone once again. "Haha, this is excellent," he said as he picked up the green pebble. It was considerably heavier than he expected, but still within a tolerable range. He took the water bottle from his backpack, drank it in its entirety, and then dropped the pebble in there. He had picked up something incredible without much hassle. Wait a minute, was it supposed to be so easy? Lex looked towards the stone hut, but it seemed uninhabited. A brief investigation revealed that the hut was empty, with no indication of anyone having been here in a while. Lex shrugged and decided to take a break before continuing. He had been wearing the crown for a long time and could feel the strain on his mind. One power nap later, Lex left the clearing and headed towards the focal point. He did not notice, as he left, that the bottle he had placed the pebble in had turned to stone. He picked up his speed now, even going as far as stopping his array practice. He had finished his water and had only a small amount of rations left. When he had packed his gear for this trip, he had packed enough with the assumption that he could supplement his reserves by foraging or hunting, but this realm had yet to show him a single plant, and the creatures he encountered were simply too disgusting to be edible. But, with the crown on his head, and his thoughts much clearer, it did not take long for him to come up with a possible solution. He found it too coincidental that just as he tried to attune his instincts towards treasure, he found some yet had never given him any such indications before. The most likely possibility was that he could channel his instincts towards something, instead of relying on them to work on their own. Danger was probably the only thing that would automatically trigger them. To put this theory to the test, he firmly made his mind to search for food while he continued to journey towards the focal point. Speaking of which, his journey was by no means simple or uneventful. The mountain was infested with 3 feet (0.9 meters) long lizards that had bodies as hard as rocks. Fighting them off was extremely tedious, as Lex could ultimately only use brute strength to defeat them. They were too numerous to attempt evisceration on, as it would only target a single enemy at a time, and they moved and attacked too quickly for him to complete an entire array. The ridiculous strength of his right arm ended up being his saving grace, and he became somewhat of an expert in this real-life version of whack-a-mole. The lizards, of course, did not provide Lex with any meat once disposed of, because as soon as they died, their bodies could crumble to dust. At least it provided him an opportunity to practice his newfound strength. That, alongside the fact that he had chosen enchanted gloves instead of a weapon, would make anyone think Lex had pre-planned this. Several hours later, when Lex ate the last of his rations without finding anything to replenish his supply, he frowned slightly despite the crown dimming his usual emotions. It was not like he couldn't survive without food or water, just that he would continuously get weaker. In case he encountered a tough fight, it would put him at a disadvantage. How he missed the days when he could just buy stuff from the gift shop. With a sigh, Lex pushed away any distractions and picked up his speed. He made a mental note to ask Quenhild if there were any storage space items or easier way to transport goods available for sale. The convenience of the inn's inventory was remarkable, but it was limited by the system's various rules. If he could get something like that without the restrictions, it would solve many of his problems. Lex's journey through the mountains continued for another 4 days. He did not find anything to replenish his food supply or his water, and he dared not drink the water produced by the green pebble without testing it on another creature first. Instead, he repeatedly used the water to wash his body. Now, his entire right arm and left fist had undergone the strange process of turning to stone and converting back. The boost in strength was extremely welcome, for he was beginning to feel weak otherwise. It was not severe yet, and Lex could last much longer due to the fact that he was a body cultivator, but undoubtedly the decline had begun. But at last, on the final day, he approached the focal point. A massive arch was built right on the side of one of the mountains, revealing a tunnel that led deep within the mountain's core. The tunnel was littered with corpses of imps and trolls, and sounds of an ongoing fight could be heard from deep within. The fact that someone had made their way here was within Lex's expectations. In fact, it was probably a good thing, because he would have had real trouble facing so many enemies. Utilizing his arrays would have been the only option available to him. Lex reached into his backpack and retrieved an item given to him by Quenhild, a silver mask. Since they were doing something shady, they should follow the usual protocols and hide Lex's identity. Putting on the silver mask, Lex proceeded into the tunnel, doing his best to avoid making too much noise. The tunnel, still well lit by the reflected rays of light, took Lex nearly half an hour to cross with his reduced speed, and opened up into a massive cave. It was completely bare, giving Lex no option to hide from the battle taking place. Nearly 20 humans were fighting over 30 trolls, with no imps having survived the battle so far. Lex could not see the focal point, leading him to believe it was right in the center. Tired, and more mentally drained than anything else, Lex let out a deep sigh. But, the next moment, he looked extremely energized as he used Heart's Marathon and dashed right into the fight. He did not actually mean to participate in the battle which, alongside guidance from his keen intuition, allowed him to avoid most of the trolls. It was only when he reached the middle of the battlefield that his presence was noticed, both by the trolls and the humans. But none of it mattered. In front of him was the focal point, an oddly shaped rock balanced perfectly on a metallic dais. "Who are you?" one of the fighting men roared in anger, while a troll just screamed at him. Perhaps, if he had been well rested and fed, Lex would have taken the opportunity to deliver a quip, but as it was, he simply dodged all attempts to stop him and jumped at the focal point. Like a mother hen protecting her egg, Lex sat upon the boulder and began channeling his spirit energy into it, while he held out both his hands and used Talk to the Hand, blocking all attacks. Even the state of flow could not help him come up with a better plan, and only guided him how to best implement his stupid plan, which was to flaunt his defense for as long as it took. Chapter 317 Private Audience. The nearest troll and human both stopped their fight and attacked Lex with a burning fury, only to be blocked by his invisible barrier. The troll's anger only grew, and it redoubled its efforts, but the human paused after the shock of a failed attempt. Still, it only took a glance to be able to pick out a flaw in Lex's so-called defense. If the barrier extended from his hand, and he was holding it forward, all he needed to do was attack from a different angle. It was the deduction of an experienced fighter, but alas, it made no difference, as Lex simply moved one of his hands so that instead of one strengthened barrier, he had two. His plan was simple: he would block as many attacks as he could, and should any get through, he'd just suffer them. There were a few reasons why he chose to follow this method. First, he was confident in his defense, obviously. Second, while he was confident he could fight the humans and the trolls here if he met them one-on-one, in a group like this, he had no doubt that he could not win. The coordination of a team was something that would put him at a severe disadvantage. Third, and most importantly, it was only when he finally sat on the rock that it occurred to him that he could have waited for them to at least finish fighting before making a move. That way, there would at least be fewer opponents targeting him. But after days of no food, water, and limited sleep, Lex was finding it hard to think clearly. There was, however, one unexpected pleasant surprise for Lex. He was anticipating taking control of the focal point to be a process that lasted several hours. Yet when he channeled his spirit energy into the rock, he felt none of the resistance Quenhild warned him of. Instead, it flowed freely into the core and started binding the rock to him. In the meantime, the troll and the human continued to attack him, to no avail. After a minute, the furious fight surrounding had slowed down, as the trolls and humans alike tried to understand what was happening. Then it stopped. There was a moment of disbelief shared by both parties as they looked at Lex, who was actually sitting on the rock with his legs wrapped around it, gripping it tightly. The humans quickly retreated, freeing the trolls to surround Lex and battering him from all sides. They weren't really afraid, for they knew the usual time to take control of the focal point was a few hours. Instead, they used this reprieve to rest and recover their strength. They planned on letting Lex attract all the trolls' attention. Either when Lex fell off, or when they were ready, they would attack again, kill the further exhausted trolls, and finally achieve their goal. It was a good plan. Furthermore, they took great pleasure in watching the occasional troll attack slip past Lex's barrier and smash him, though he seemed mostly unhurt. Their plan came to an end, though, 5 minutes later when Lex finished merging with the focal point. The all-too-familiar feeling of control over the realm filled Lex, and, with a wave of his hand, all the humans were kicked out of the realm, and the surrounding trolls kicked off to some distant corner of the minor realm. He felt a tide of energy begin to rush into his body, but before it could make any real progress, it suddenly disappeared, absorbed by the system. Lex glanced at the amount of energy accumulated, smiled as he saw the number at 4%, and teleported out as well. He appeared in Quenhild's living room once again, and received the same treatment of being swarmed by doctors. "Water," he said hoarsely. To his dismay, the doctors refused to cater to his request until they fully understood his situation. He rolled his eyes in annoyance, but let them do their job. Eventually, when they were finished with their diagnosis, Lex was provided with a small portion of some kind of soup. It would serve to both rehydrate him and quench his hunger. Furthermore, it was filled with several extremely valuable spirit plants that would speed up recovery. Foregoing all etiquette, Lex picked up the bowl, put it to his mouth, and began gulping it down. A part of him told him to take it slow, as he should not just eat so much so quickly, and another part of him said screw it, he was a cultivator, he could handle it. Lex let out a satisfied and long ah once he finished, and threw himself on a sofa to relax. He took off the crown and the mask, mostly because being so focused all the time drained him greatly. He would think about its limitations later, when he wasn't so groggy. Just before he fell asleep, Quenhild arrived in the room with a look of excitement and anticipation in her eyes. Before she could ask anything, Lex said, "Have your buyer ready. We'll make the deal when I wake up." He closed his eyes and instantly fell asleep, snoring lightly. Quenhild chuckled as she signaled everyone to leave the room and dimmed the lights. Outside, a woman who looked remarkably similar to Quenhild was standing, an amused look on her face. Nora Haugen, head of the Haugen estate, Earth Immortal and an official wife of King Cornelius, was not an easy woman to meet, even for Quenhild. She was an enigma to everyone, her child included. No one knew what her goals were, they only knew that she was a woman who got what she wanted. Even the king ended up marrying her. Yet, such a woman had promptly dropped everything and returned to the academy upon hearing news of her daughter's confirmation into the core of the academy. Was it out of pride and love? Not really. Quenhild sent her a message informing her that if she didn't come, Quenhild would destroy her art collection. "Is that your half-brother?" she asked, amused. "I can see a bit of Cornelius flair in him, but it's too mild for now. Right now, he's not my half-brother, he's my business partner." "Have you arranged everything?" "Yes, the buyer is ready. He will never know who sold him the realm, but the price still needs to be negotiated. We'll need access to the realm to gauge its worth." "What about the assassins? Did you find out who sent them?" "I'm your mother, not your nanny. You can take care of these minor things on your own." Quenhild pursed her lips in mild frustration, but suppressed her rising emotions. "Well, what about that thing? I've entered the core academy before entering the golden core realm, and fulfilled your requirements. When will we leave?" "That thing? Why the need to be so secretive? It's just going over to the crystal realm and having them disperse your cultivation and designing a custom cultivation technique for you to cultivate the truth path. The arrangements are made. We can leave once your business is concluded. But, you have to remember, if we do this, you owe me 2 favors." "Say whatever you want, I'm not letting you pick my husband," Quenhild said as she rolled her eyes. This mother of hers, all she wanted was grandkids. "What? I would never. But 2 favors, remember that. I don't owe you anything, you're the one who set the conditions for this exchange. That's because you were being annoying and kept breaking my things. 2 favors. 0 favors, no husband, and you have to help with negotiations. Don't test me, I know where you've planted your pink dream tea. I'll feed it to the dogs." "Is this how you talk to your mother?" Nora exclaimed, her face contorting in anger and her immortal aura leaking a bit, but Quenhild was unperturbed. This woman who could manipulate kings and had more than one nation wrapped around her finger had no idea how to be a mother, and Quenhild knew her weakness well. "By the way, did you hear about my name?" Quenhild continued the conversation, uncaring. One of the main reasons she dropped her father's name was because it would irritate her mother to no end. It would be so entertaining to watch. Lex's cultivation professor, the one who had taught about the true path, and suspected Lex's cultivation path, had just left one of his classes when he received a letter. A long time ago, he had requested to see the king. He was only a normal professor at the academy, so he did not hold much influence. Yet to be selected as a professor at the academy was no small feat, so even with his limited influence, he was eventually able to finally get a response. 1 month later, he would be granted a private audience. Chapter 318, Friendly Fish. Lex woke up feeling extremely refreshed. His body felt as if he had just come from a hot spring, and the mental drain from the prolonged use of the crown, as well as the physical strain from lack of food, was gone. He credited it to his nap, but if he were to know the value of the ingredients used in the soup he would be startled. Even the Midnight Inn did not serve food of that quality yet. Naturally, Quenhild would not treat her business partner poorly. Before he got up, though, he had to attend to a small matter. Back at the inn, the Lady Cosmos show was still ongoing, but it was now time for him to set up the expo for Earth. Unlike Lady Cosmos, which required the inn to manage the event, the expo only required the inn to host it and market it. Since it was his home planet, he didn't want to treat it lightly, and asked the planning department to design an appropriate auditorium for the event. At the same time, he spent 800,000 MP on marketing. While the reach of the inn had spread far and wide, he chose to target 2 fronts for this. All the planets in from the X14 star system would be targeted, since they were commercial planets in a way. More importantly though, indirectly, he gave Booty a commission to spread the word in large and small trade planets. He didn't need to worry about much else, as the preparations for the Lady Cosmos event could be shared for this. With that done, he picked himself up from the sofa and stretched. Unfortunately, a drawback of having his body brought back into peak condition was that he was unable to get the satisfying cracks in his knuckles or any of his bones while he stretched. He sent Quenlet a message, and soon she arrived. It did not take a detective to notice the extra spring in her step, which Lex took as a sign that she had arranged a buyer. "Did you sleep well?" she asked as she sat down. A host of waiters had followed her into the room and began to lay down a feast for Lex and her. "I slept perfectly." "How long was I out?" "Almost 13 hours. You're lucky you woke up when you did. I almost couldn't wait anymore and dumped a tub of water on you." "Patience is a virtue," Lex said as he stuffed 6 dumplings in his mouth. "The only virtue I subscribe to is money. We can't begin negotiations until we get an idea of what the realm is like, but you've blocked off the entrance. Open it up so I can send in a team of appraisers." "Oh, my bad," Lex said as he snapped, unsealing the realm. "Once we have a detailed understanding of the realm, we can assign a price to it. We already have more than one buyer ready, so we'll get the best price for it. Do you have any special requirements as far as the payment is concerned?" "I have a few things in mind," said Lex, though he had not slowed down his consumption of food for even a moment during this conversation. There was a look of deep regret in his eyes as he looked at the now empty dish of dumplings, but he turned his attention elsewhere. "What are the chances of getting hands on a spatial treasure? Something you can store gear or items in?" Before Quenhild could even answer, a woman chuckled. The sound of her laughter filled Lex with immense shock and dread, for she had been standing right beside him this entire time, but he had failed to notice her till she made a sound. The feeling only lasted a moment, though, and Lex started attacking a plate of fresh barbecue with vigor. Spatial treasures exist, but they don't fall out of the sky. It would require someone with advanced knowledge of spatial laws to even attempt constructing one. Even most immortals don't have one, so you can forget about getting your hands on one. Oh no, wait, actually, if you stumble onto another realm full of sleeping crystals, you can trade with the crystal race for it. Unfortunately for you, we've already cashed in the favor we received for the last batch." Quenhild looked at her mother with irritation. Even she had not realized her mother had been snooping. "Lex, this is my mother, Nora. We'll be using her channels to sell the realm." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Lex said with a sly half-smile. If he did not have a cheek full of meat, he may have even looked suave. Honestly, he was too hungry to care right now. If a spatial treasure is out of reach, then I want my share all to be in energy crystals. Or spirit water. Whatever the densest form of energy is available, really. First, go for quality, but when that runs out, you can replace it with quantity. Both Quenhild and Nora were taken aback by the unusual request. "All of it? Are you sure?" Quenhild asked hesitantly. She knew Lex had his own motives, but did he really understand the amount of wealth being discussed right now? There was a huge possibility that he was underestimating what that would result in. "Yeah, all of it. If possible, make the sale as quickly as possible, and while you're doing it, give me another list of the remaining minor realms and their details. I'll also give you a list of new supplies, you should prepare those as well. There are just a few things I need to take care of in the meantime." "Wait, you're planning on going again?" Quenhild asked. "This is not really the kind of business that can remain under the table for long. Someone will surely notice, and they won't like that we're cheating with the core academy tests. Don't worry about it. At most, you can just put the blame on me if anything goes wrong. Besides, they can't blame me for being more skilled than their other students. And I have an entrepreneurial spirit, what's wrong with that? At most, I can just say I was inspired by the Academy's motto of not giving a shit." Quenhild paused as she thought of the various obstacles they would face should they continue, but Nora had a massive grin on her face. It was good to see the kids growing on their own. She decided not to help in case they got into trouble. This Lex had been using the Academy's motto too frequently, and had even influenced her daughter. She hoped he got a spanking. In fact, she would look forward to it. The discussion went on for a while, but Lex eventually convinced her of his plan. After all, Lex was going after that energy in more minor realms regardless of anything. Might as well make the most of it. Once he was done with dinner, though, Lex left to go to the library. He knew he couldn't achieve mastery overnight, but his experience gave him insight into more techniques that he needed to learn. First, he needed a stealth technique, followed by a reconnaissance one. He also needed lighter and more versatile attacks. His increased strength gave him many new options. Finally, he wanted to look up information on the green pebble that he found. He really wanted to know if the water it produced was safe to drink, and what effects it would yield. He spent the next day doing research, and when he returned to Quenhild, the negotiations for the sale of the realm were complete. She presented Lex with a contract that detailed their division of profits, as well as the remuneration he would be getting and a bunch of minor legalities. He signed it, transferred the minor realm through a method she taught him to an intermediary who would then pass it to the client. As much as he wanted to see his income with his own eyes, he had little time to waste. There were only a few dozen realms left at the Foundation realm that were unclaimed, and he wanted to get his hands on as many of them as possible. Lex chose the next realm and went through the next portal. It was supposed to be a winter wonderland, with ice and snow blanketing everything. The sub-zero temperatures and local beasts made it difficult for others to operate in the realm, but Lex could simply use the same technique he used to avoid the cold produced by the Frio birds. But nothing was destined to go according to plan. When Lex teleported to the realm, he found himself submerged in freezing water. Above him, there was a thick layer of ice sealing whatever water body he was in shut, and surrounding him were hundreds of fish. What were the chances they were friendly? Chapter 319 Magic Carpet. He readied himself to be swarmed by the fish, but nothing happened. The school of fat, red fish stared at him with their wide eyes full of curiosity. One hesitantly broke free from the rest and came close to Lex, as if observing an animal at a zoo. It swam in a circle around Lex, to look at him from all sides before it came closer, as if to test Lex's intentions. Amused at the fish, Lex slowly reached out his hand and softly rubbed the fish's scales, which the fish seemed to enjoy. Its eyes rolled back slightly and gurgled a little, as if to show enjoyment. Lex smirked. He was reminded of fat red fish he'd seen in an anime before called Magikarpet. He made special note of this fish and decided to add some whenever he got back to the inn. For now, though, he turned his attention back to the ice above him. If he didn't exert himself too much, he could survive underwater for a couple of hours, but that was no reason to stay underwater any longer than he needed to. Under the fish's supervision, Lex swam to the ice and after testing its sturdiness, punched it as hard as he could with his right hand. There was a loud bang, and massive cracks spread in the ice, but besides that there was nothing else. Surprisingly, the fish did not swim away, as if they were not at all intimidated by his display of strength. Were he not underwater, he would have sighed. These minor realms really tested his versatility. Fortunately, he was not in a rush nor was he under attack, which gave him plenty of time to form an array. But first, Lex used the same technique he used back then against the Frio bird's cold storm. The chill of the freezing water stopped affecting, and an array character meaning ice appeared on the back of his hand. With his hand, he rubbed the cracks and tried to get a sense for how thick the ice was. It was impossible to simply see through it, and at most he could vaguely see how deep the crack traveled in the ice. He roughly estimated the ice was 3 or 4, 0.9 to 1.2 feet thick. He took a moment to recall if the book inside the ring given to him by John had any pre-established arrays he could use in his current situation. There were a few, but they were inelegant solutions that either deployed excessive brute force or fire power. This was a good opportunity for him to try creating his own array. He broke down the task into 2 simple actions. He needed to cut a hole in the ice, and pushed the cut ice out to create an opening for him to escape. He then further broke down each action into individual steps. To create a hole, the ice needed to be cut continuously, preferably in a circular shape with a diameter of at least 3 feet, 0.9 meters. The cutting force also needed to be sufficient to cut all the way through for the process to be effective. Pushing the ice out also required sufficient force applied in the appropriate direction for an adequate amount of time. The pushing force should only activate after the cut has been complete, otherwise the upwards force, combined with the action of the ice being cut, could cause the ice to fracture, making it more difficult to remove. He identified a few more parameters for the required array, then began to think about what characters he needed. Each character existed naturally in nature and had a unique purpose and place, so he needed to pick carefully. For example, while there may not necessarily be a character for cut, there may be one with the same effect. Furthermore, that character then needed to be paired with other characters determining shape, but at the same time be compatible with the kind of character being used to cut. In this situation, a cylindrical shape was the best option. Moreover, the kind of force used also had to be compatible with the task as well as the material. Minor details such as the timing and order of tasks would be determined by the format and syntax of the array, not the characters themselves. Lex equipped the crown, which he had named as his thinking cap, and quickly thought about the makeup of the array. Typically, this was the kind of thing that would take him a while to figure out. But his elevated cultivation as well as state of flow allowed him to determine the entire array in a couple of minutes, even allowing him to run some mental simulations of how he expected things to play out. So far, he had been very lucky in that all of his self-created arrays so far had worked as intended. It was time to test his skill once again. Using his index finger, he began to draw the characters required, his drawing speed elevated due to the state of flow. The next moment, the array disappeared, and before Lex's eyes he saw the ice started to be cut. It was too slow. At this rate, it would take him an hour to escape the ice. He made a few adjustments to the array, swam slightly to the side and drew the array again. This time, it worked as he imagined. A perfect circle was cut right into the ice and, after a second's delay, the cylindrical ice was shot up into the air with a loud bang, moving faster than Lex could track it. Good enough, Lex thought, as he waved goodbye to all the fish, and began climbing out of the hole, right into a raging snowstorm. Lex literally could not see more than a few feet out in front of him, though fortunately that had no impact on the Lotus' ability to detect the direction of the accumulated energy in this realm. The cold was hardly an obstacle for Lex, and the additional armor provided to him through the ice character helped him out a lot when he was attacked by the annoying yet familiar Culter. He had been attacked by these irritating snowflake spirits back during his assessment, but he was much more capable this time. Relative to his previous realm, this one was a lot easier to tackle for Lex. Often encountered creatures he could hunt and cook, though cooking was difficult since the snowstorm never ceased. 8 days later, Lex managed to capture this realm as well. The focal point was in the shape of all things, a fireplace. Due to the intensity of the storm, no other humans had been able to find it, and it was not defended by any creature either, making it extremely easy for Lex to capture the realm. Once it was done, and Lex absorbed the energy, he had accumulated a total of 9% of his total required energy. He only needed to pay 5% to complete his quest and establish the Midnight Tavern, though he planned on accumulating more than the minimum required. Once he returned, Quenhild told him the previous realm had been sold, and that only 7 unowned realms at the foundation level remained. Lex quickly handed over control of this realm as well and, after some rest, continued to travel to more realms. This time, his luck was not so good, as after 4 days, before he even managed to approach the focal point, someone else captured it. But, such a thing was predictable, since he was entering late to begin with. He did not waste time and continued to enter more realms. He was so focused during this period that he did not even notice his steady improvements in using his techniques, or his skill with arrays. More than once, he managed to use arrays in the heat of battle, but he was in such a time crunch that he could not slow down to celebrate. It would not be easy to once again encounter random reserves of energy just sitting around. 3.5 weeks later, he had managed to only capture one more realm, due to the fact that someone else would claim it before him. Still, it was pretty good as he had brought his energy accumulation up to 12%. One final realm remained, still unowned, and apparently the difficulty in capturing this realm was incredibly high. More than one group had given up, though that was not enough to deter Lex. Not only was his situation unique, allowing him to have a higher threshold for danger, but he was incredibly skilled. Moreover, he had begun to enjoy challenging himself like this. But, just as Quenhild had the portal opened for him, and he was about to step through, his oh-so-reliable instincts acted up, and gave him a warning he had never encountered before. Chapter 320 Impending Danger. Quenhild, her assistants, the professor who opened the portal and Nora all immediately picked up on Lex's oddity when he suddenly stopped. Over the past few weeks, the actual accumulated time they'd spent with Lex was probably less than a day, but he'd made an impression on them nonetheless. Just the simple fact that he, alone, could claim a minor realm, while others usually went in massive teams and still often failed, was already enough to crown all the legends floating around about Lex already. The fact that he did it more than once was even more ridiculous. But, it was more than that. Every time they saw Lex, it was after a long, extensive period where he would be trying to claim a minor realm. As such, the changes brought about in Lex were always loud and pronounced. Everything from the way he stood, sat, walked and talked seemed to change each time. Instead of becoming more coarse, as one would expect after spending an extended time in the wild, he became more refined. In the beginning, after capturing his first minor realm, Lex began to radiate confidence befitting a warrior of his skill and standing. Yet, with each successive trip, instead of that overwhelming, blatant confidence that would cause others to feel inferior or insecure about themselves, he began to carry himself with charm and charisma. His smile was deeper, his eyes brighter, his each move a flourishing dance. Instead of feeling inferior in the presence of his success, others would feel uplifted by his warmth. Of course, the foundation of all that growth was built on a basis of self-confidence. During this period, not only had Lex overcome unimaginable trials, he'd washed his entire body in the water from the green pebble until it no longer affected him. His strength now was devastating. While it wasn't as ridiculous as his defense, he was definitely living up to the usual standards of body cultivators now. All that remained now was to drink as much of that water as his body could absorb. Moreover, Lex knew his limits well, and knew exactly how and when to push them to further his growth. Once he said he would do something, he would do it without hesitation or reluctance, and with an excited smile on his face. It could be said that if earlier on, he was filled with potential, then his numerous experiences and challenges in the realms allowed him to truly bring out that potential. Yet now, suddenly, he froze. Not only that, the expression on his face, for the briefest moment, flashed with concern. It was only a single moment, after which he quickly collected himself, his usual carefree expression returning to his face. "You know what?" Lex said, as he turned back towards Quenhild. "I changed my mind. Instead of pushing my luck endlessly, I should take a step back, and enjoy my success so far." "How long do you think it'll take you to sell the last realm?" "A few days, a week, max. We still need to complete an analysis of the realm's worth before taking bids," Quenhild answered, reserving her curiosity. The amount of money they'd made so far was truly phenomenal, so she did not feel disappointed. Being too greedy could cause problems, so it was best to know when to stop. Still, she would ask Lex what happened when there were fewer people around. "Haha, I would expect nothing less. I have a few things I need to take care of, so I'm going to head out." Then, casually, as if nothing unusual happened, Lex left her apartment. During this time, he'd become a lot more familiar with Quenhild, so he didn't mind using some of her things, which is why he got in one of the many self-driving vehicles she had and entered his destination. When he finally left her apartment, his expression changed to a frown. He was getting very unusual feedback from his instincts. He was not being warned of danger in the typical sense. Instead, he felt like his time was running out. It was a very suffocating feeling, since he could not tell exactly what he was being warned from. All he knew was that with each passing second, something unfavorable to him was coming closer. He sent Quenhild a message, telling her to speed up the sale as much as possible. It was fine to suffer a loss in profits if needed, but she should conclude the sale today. Since he had asked for payment in the form of energy in the densest available forms, whether it was spirit stones or water or anything else, she had been holding his payment for him in a bank vault. He also asked her to have everything prepared as he would visit the vault with her as soon as the sale was concluded. He knew they had noticed something in his behavior, but since Lex did not know the origin of whatever was coming his way, he decided not to share too much. There were a couple of things Lex wanted to do in the meantime. First, he wanted to visit the library and quickly jot down a few more techniques he'd thought of. His system was really pathetic in the ways of helping him out with his cultivation journey, so kept having to anticipate anything he would need. Secondly, he wanted to say goodbye to Amelia. She was the only friend he had at the academy, besides Quenhild. He felt bad not being able to spend time with her the past couple of months, but he had been extremely busy and he had to prioritize. At the library, among other techniques, the one Lex really needed was called tranquil mind. He had often been using his thinking cap, and excessive use would often cause him to suffer from extreme mental exhaustion. Sometimes, even a long sleep would not help him recover, and it would take days before he was back in peak form. Tranquil mind was a meditation technique focused on not only strengthening his mind, regulating his emotions and calming his thoughts, but also replenishing his mental energy. He spent a few more hours here, trying to learn any random technique he thought might come in handy. He didn't need to worry about not remembering them, for with the help of his thinking cap, his memories became extremely sharp and this was a non-issue. Then it was time to say goodbye to Amelia. He found her exactly as she was the first time he bumped into her, eating with her other friends. He did not elaborate on what he would be doing, but only apologized about being so busy, and said that there was a decent chance they might not have the opportunity to meet again in a long time. He saw a lot of complicated emotions in her eyes, but, ultimately, she only called him silly for apologizing, as there was no need, and wished him well. He would have liked to have said more, but his instincts were beginning to send tingles down his spine now. He messaged Quenhild asking about the bank's details, and directly set off towards it. When he arrived, she was waiting for him with her mother beside her. She was no longer hiding her curiosity, as a hint of concern showed on her face. "Is everything all right?" she asked, unsure if she should be intruding. "Haha, everything is great," Lex replied with genuine excitement in his eyes. "Let's go see how much money I've made." The procedure for entering the bank's vault was extremely complicated, and Lex just found out that if it weren't for Quenhild's mother accompanying them, it would take a couple of weeks before Lex's verification process was complete, which would allow him to enter the vault. As for the fact that it was his own wealth that had been stored there, it was inconsequential. Quenhild was the one who put it in the bank, so as far as they were concerned, Lex was just there to accompany her. Lex rubbed his hands as he let his thoughts run wild, his imagination going to a cartoon he used to watch as a child of a cat and mouse called Timothy and Jeremy, in which their eyes used to turn into dollar signs when they were about to receive money. He could imagine what that felt like. But it was not a mountain of coins waiting for him, nor a pile of spirit stones. Instead, 10 neatly stacked crystals were the only things waiting for him when he entered. "Underwhelmed?" Nora asked, as she saw him observing them. "I'm assuming they're the densest form of energy available," he guessed as he tried to sense something from the crystals. They were so clear, they would have been invisible had there not been a thin, blue ribbon tied to each one. "Not the densest, but it's up there," she said, looking at them. "Since it'll be hard for you to understand, I'll put it like this. These are used by the crystal race to cultivate. They're extremely precious resources that the Hum nation exports, since the energy is too violent for humans to absorb. But if humans could, this is what immortals would be using." "Not bad," Lex said with an approving nod. "Can I have a moment alone?" Nora raised an eyebrow, but quietly left so that Lex could be alone. The whole reason she had come along, other than to sate her curiosity, was for Lex's security should he want to take them out of the bank, as a favor to her daughter. Most likely, he still did not understand how valuable they were. But it was none of her business. She just wondered what he needed it for. Inside the bank vault, Lex placed his hand on the crystals and, after a moment, they vanished. To Lex's immense surprise, his energy accumulation actually increased by a whole 8%. He now had a total of 20%. Without any hesitation, he paid 10 million MP and 5% energy needed to establish the Midnight Tavern, and heard the familiar ting of a system notification. Lex's professor sat nervously in the palace as he waited his turn to see the king. Honestly, he never thought he'd get an opportunity to see the king up close, let alone have an audience with him. This was, of course, because he never expected to have a reason good enough to request an audience. But now, soon, he would have his chance. His attention was attracted to the sound of a door opening, and an escort of guards came in. It was time to meet the king.